Notre Dame fans, Irish Breakdown Nation, welcome back. It is Thursday, and as promised, we said we are going to do the all-opponent team. And Ryan, this is going to be a really quick show because apparently if I don't have an Ohio State kid at every single position, then we are haters of the Buckeyes. So pick an Ohio State starter, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you guys tomorrow. No, in all seriousness, we're going to actually pick a real all-opponent team, and we're going to have some fun with it. And then at the end, after that, we're going to kind of go, what are the best position groups that Notre Dame is going to face? You know, forget individual players. Like, what's the best backfield? What's the best receiving core? There will be a heavy Ohio State influence there. But when we go individual players, there's some really good football players in the schedule, Ryan. And there's a couple positions that it was almost kind of like pull a name out of a hat because there's really nobody. I mean, defensive end is going to – my answer, defensive end, is going to be really interesting after Myles Murphy. There's a couple other positions where it's like, there's really nobody good, but, you know, let's just – this guy happens to be the best of the mediocre players. So in other areas, it was the opposite. Picking three receivers was not easy because there's at least four that deserve to be on this list, and you can make a case for even more. So we had some fun with it, and I think you all are going to have some fun with it. And then after we do that, we're going to go, what would the all-opponent team look like if we included Notre Dame players? And no, it won't be the Ohio State Homer version of it. It's not going to be 22 kids of Notre Dame. We're going to have some fun with it and talk about who are the Notre Dame players that truly belong in the best of the best conversation. So that's what we are going to do today, Ryan. And, of course, we're going to start on offense because that's what I like to do. I like to start on offense. And further increasing my bias, we're going to start a quarterback. And I would argue, Ryan, that, and you and I discussed this before the show, I would argue this is the strongest position group on Notre Dame's schedule when you look at it from its entirety. I think you could make an argument for receiver, and you did. Mm-hmm. But I think it's quarterback because I think if the quarterbacks play to their potential this season, there are four really, really good quarterbacks on the schedule. But the best of the best, and it's not really a conversation, is C.J. Stroud from Ohio State.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, like, there's Tanner Mckee from Stanford, who deserves a slight mention. Jaron Hall is a good player from BYU. Of course, Phil Dracovich's a guy that both of us really like. Caleb Williams has the ability to be kind of the dynamic dual threat player for USC potentially this year under Lincoln Riley. But CJ Stroud is a Heisman Trophy finalist last year. He's an early favorite to maybe be the first quarterback.
Right.
Yes.
And that wasn't a fluke. That was, he's good because he plays in this system and he's got three great receivers. Well, yeah, that's all true. But he's also really good.
Yes. I mean, Brian, honestly, because you look at that wide receiver group last year, and it's easy to make that assumption, right?
Sure.
Like Jackson Smith and Jigba and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, and you look around and you're like, oh, now he's got Marvin Harrison Jr. is probably going to be the next big thing, and Mckee and Julian Fleming, and there's a lot of talented receivers. But the maturation that you saw from him from game one to the end of the season, I mean, by the end of the season, he was playing fantastic football, and it wasn't just chuck it up and let your guy make a play. It was, let's get through our process. Let's get through our reads, get through our progressions, make plays, get more comfortable in the pocket. He was a much better player by the end of the season, and he deserves all the fanfare that he gets. He could be the first pick in the draft next year, potentially. We'll see what happens with the quarterback position. He's definitely going to be in the Heisman race, at least to start the year. He's a really good football player, and he deserves all the mention. But to your point, there is also a lot of good quarterbacks on
and that's why we wanted to kind of talk about it as a whole, because it's almost like it's almost sort of disrespectful if we don't talk about the potential big year that Caleb Williams could have at USC in a similar situation. Really good offensive system. He's going to have really good talent around him at receiver, at running back, just like CJ Stroud is going to have at both of those things. Mm-hmm. I would argue that CJ Stroud has a better offensive line coming back, but Caleb Williams is going to be playing inferior competition, if we're being honest, in the Pac-12. So he's going to have a big year statistically. Phil Dracovic, we think if he stays healthy, is going to have a big year statistically. Jaron Hall's a kid I really enjoy watching play. He's in a different level than those other kids as a sort of projecting to the next level. But as a college football player, he's a really good college quarterback. I really enjoy watching him. And then, of course, Tanner Mckee is, if you're just talking projection, could have a really big year this year. His receiving core's healthy. I just wish they had better offensive line play in regard to if we're just looking at Tanner's projection. And, there was a kid that I really liked on the schedule that transferred to Grant Wells from Marshall, that transferred to Virginia Tech, who would have been on this conversation. So the quarterback play would have even been better if it wasn't for some transfers. And then you kind of go through the schedule. Drake May was a 4-star recruit who's taken over at North Carolina. Garrett Schrader's a real dynamic runner at Syracuse. Not really much of a passer last year, but really good rushing quarterback. Had over 10 touchdowns last year, I believe, correct?
He led on a offense that has Sean Tucker, who's one of the best running backs in college football as well. He led them in rushing touchdowns with 14. So it's really nice production.
Just some good quarterbacks on the schedule this year, Ryan. Just all across the schedule, which makes this I think that's where you look and say, okay, this could be the thing that makes this schedule a little bit more challenging than what it might otherwise be, is because you do have some good quarterbacks that, and Garrett Schrader's had some games where you're like, if he can play like that more consistently, this kid could be pretty dangerous. Yep. And so that's what makes this schedule, and there's some other familiar names. So Jack Plummer is going to be, Notre Dame's going to have to face him again this year at Cal. He transferred from Purdue to Cal. He's okay, big, strong arm kid, just not necessarily a great quarterback. So that's going to be fun. So quarterback, CJ Stroud, and you and I did a top 15 quarterbacks in the country. And I actually had CJ Stroud as my number one quarterback, period. In the country, not just Notre Dame opponents. But, I didn't argue that you had Bryce Young. I mean, hello, you won the Heisman Trophy last year and he put up monster numbers.
Right.
But he also played 2 more games than CJ Stroud did when you compare the numbers. And he also played with a pretty good receiving core. So I think
Brian, I know that we were unanimous on this pick, right, with CJ Stroud. I think it's kind of a no-brainer. If I had to ask you who would have been your second option if CJ Stroud was not on the schedule, do you have like a clear winner there? Because I think you can go a couple different ways, right?
No, there's 2 ways I would have looked at it. It would have been Caleb Williams or Phil Dracovic. And the reason I'd have gone Caleb Williams is just statistically, he's going to put up better numbers, right? Agreed. So if we're just looking statistics, if we're talking about a guy that I really think is going to impact the game, I really believe that Phil Dracovic's going to have a big year this year. Now, the problem would be, how can you manifest that comparison when you're going to look at the numbers, when Phil Dracovic's going to play in more of a pro style? They're not up-tempo. They're not going to run as many plays as USC. They're not going to throw the ball as much as USC. But as far as just a guy that can put a team on his shoulders, I think Phil Dracovic's going to be in that conversation. But the combination of numbers plus impact, I probably would have leaned towards Caleb Williams. And also, Caleb's coming off of a good year where Phil's coming off of an injury and didn't play a ton, and he was – really not himself the last 4 games of the year, but still, won a couple, went 4-2 as a starter last year. So he's got to prove to me he can stay healthy. That's the big thing that Phil's got to do, which is probably the final piece that would probably have me leaning towards Caleb Williams, but it wouldn't shock me if Phil Dracovic is in that conversation. And I'll tell you something right now. If the Stanford offensive line plays well this year, we're going to be talking about Tanner Mckee possibly being in that conversation too, because he's going to, assuming they can stay, there's a lot of ifs with Stanford. They got to stay healthy. The offensive line's got to play well. 2 things they haven't proven in years can happen at Stanford. But he's going to have some really good weapons this year. And a decent running game. If, again, the line plays well, that's a huge if, because they were, like, epically bad at running the football last year. Like, they were in the 80 – like, they made Notre Dame's offensive line last year look like the 2017 Notre Dame offensive line. I'm serious. I mean, they were that bad running the football, 80-some yards a game.
If and they have talents.
That's the crazy thing.
Like Walter Rouse looks like an NFL offensive tackle. Miles Hinton, like just from
a
body.
We had this conversation this summer, Ryan. If you took the Stanford offensive lineman from a talent standpoint and put them at Notre Dame and had Harry Hiestand coaching them, that'd be a good offensive line. But he's not coaching them, thank goodness. And so, he would be another guy that is if we're going to say like, who's your number 2 and who's your dark horse, that my dark horse would be Tanner Mckee, just because I think he's a big armed kid. For him to go on a Mormon mission and come back and kind of pick up reads and all those type of things. There's a lot of these BYU quarterbacks, not BYU quarterbacks. A lot of these quarterbacks that, like, I think of Ben Olsen, remember back in the day. These kids go on missions and they come back and they just don't process the game as well as they did before they took 2 years off. Right. And that wasn't the issue for Tanner Mckee. So he's a kid that could be in that conversation. But CJ Stroud is clearly the number 1.
Yes.
Next is a position group that is not as strong, but it wouldn't matter if it was strong, and that is at running back. And again, we're going to go with an Ohio State kid. That is Trayvion Henderson. Had a really good first year. Numbers, Ryan, are a little – if we're just looking at last year, his numbers were impressive. 1,255 yards, 15 touchdowns, really dynamic kid. His numbers are a little inflated if we're being completely honest with you. He only had 3 games where he went over 100 yards last year. But I think part of that was the line didn't play well. They were working him into things a little bit last year. They had a deep backfield. You're playing Master Teague. You're playing Mayan Williams. There was, he was splitting carries. And the line didn't play well. I mean, he went sub 5.0 yards per carry in 3 of his last 5 games. And the games he was over were against defenses that just flat out weren't good. And if you look at the 4 kind of toughest games they had last year, Nebraska, Utah, Michigan, Oregon, which I think were their most competitive games last year, he was sub 5 Nebraska. He was sub 5 yards per carry in each of those games. Yeah. And he was sub 4.5 in 3 of the 5 and was at 4.5 in another one. So, but I think that had more to do with A, he was a freshman, and B, the offensive line. I think getting Justin Fry to be their offensive line coach, you look at what he did at BC, you look at what he did at UCLA the last couple of years, really built them from a pretty soft offense to a team that was one of the, I'd say, 15 or 20 best rushing teams in the country last year. I'm not talking statistically. I'm just talking you break down their film, you look what they did. I think he did a great job with Sean Ryan, who is a guy that I know you're really high on as a blocker for UCLA. And I say, okay, they're going to be tougher. They're going to be better coach this year. Will it be enough for the opener against Notre Dame? That's a different conversation for a different day. But when you look at the end of the year, I think the Ohio State offensive line is going to be better than it was last year. And Trayvion Henderson's going to be better than he was last year. And I think his workload is going to go up because he's a year older and all that. So I think he's going to have a big, big year. And it's not so much about what he did last year, because I could pick apart his production last year and and make a case for Sean Tucker being the pick based on last year, because he was a far more consistent running back. But when you project it forward to this year, Ryan, I think this kid has a chance to be one of the best running backs in the entire country. And with all due respect to Sean Tucker, who was the better player last year, I think Trayvion Henderson's going to be clearly the better player this year.
I think it's the talent gap, honestly, because I really do like Sean Tucker, even from an NFL draft perspective. I think he's a good football player. And you had a couple guys on this schedule that, I like the Garwo kid from Boston College. I think he's a really solid runner. You look at, Marshall's Rasheed Ali is a kid that's a good football player, but I think he just stepped away from the game for a little bit. So
which is really you feel for the kid, pray for the kid. Yeah, I mean, with what he's got in front of him, potential NFL big season, to step away because he's having issues is you feel for the kid. Yeah, and that's that's all you can do. But he's another kid though, Ryan. You talk about this kid who's 1,200 yard rusher last year, 1,400 yard rusher last year. Yeah. So I mean, all that to say, Brian, is that you had, I think, 4 guys, in my opinion, that were close from a production standpoint, right? Like they're 1,000 to 1,400 yard rushers last year. But the difference, and the reason that I didn't even think twice about picking Trayvion Henderson, is because he's just the best talent on the schedule, right? And when we're projecting forward, you have a great passing game, should take some emphasis off the box. Your offensive line should be better, at least, than it was last year. There's no reason to think that he won't be very productive on top of the obvious. I mean, what's the kid going to run when he comes out? Like 4.3 something? Sure.
Like, he's incredibly fast. So
at 200 plus, I mean, he's plus 200 pounds.
Yeah, he's like 210, 215. Yeah. So he's a well-built kid too. So, I mean, he's got all the talent in the world. So you could. He's
a 4.0 student coming out of high school too, by the way.
Right. And you could convince me that if the improvements are made around him this year and just natural maturation from his own ends, that he could be the best running back in all of college football, not in just the Notre Dame schedule.
And that's kind of where I'm at, Ryan. Again, that's a projection. You can't say that based off last year. I mean, you take away the 270 plus yards against Tulsa, and he wasn't necessarily impressive from a production standpoint. Where he was impressive is, as you said, the talent is really good. And look, they're going to need to rely on him a little bit more because of the Evan Pryor injury. Evan Pryor was a kid that brought some dynamic playmaking ability, could catch the ball out of the backfield. You're going to need to Trayvion to, like, Mayan Williams is a good running back, but I don't know if Mayan Williams is a guy I want catching the ball a lot. I know didn't he have like a big long screen touchdown last year, or was that Trayvion? I think against Minnesota. I thought I forget which one of those backs had the 70-yard screen against Minnesota.
Mayan had a long play against them, but I thought it was a run, but I could be wrong. But he did have a long touchdown.
Then it must have been Trayvion that had that. So Yeah. So yeah, he didn't have Mayans was a catch, but to me, it's just he's not really a pass game threat. So it actually backs up what I was saying. He's not a pass game threat.
Right.
So I'm trying to remember. It might have been a run, Ryan. I think you're right. It was a run, but I think Trayvion can be a pass game threat.
Mm-hmm.
I think he can be a guy that's going to be able to be in the screen game, make those kind of plays. He wasn't really like a Mayan Williams is just really not a guy that you want to be using in that capacity. And then actually, no, it was Trayvion Henderson that had a 70-yard touchdown catch against Minnesota last year. I was correct on that. But he had 4 for 67 against Maryland, 5 for 54 against Michigan. This is a kid that's got potential as a pass catcher to put up really good numbers. He had 27 catches last year. I think without Evan Pryor in the lineup, you're going to see even more of that. So I think he could legitimately push for 2,000 yards of offense this year. If the only problem is Ohio State tends to really beat up the Big Ten schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Will he get enough touches to get to that level? But if they use him volume-wise enough, he's a kid that could push for 2,000, which is why, to your point, I would not be shocked if him and Bijan Robinson are battling all season, like Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall were last year for who's the best running back in the country. I mean, would you agree that was kind of the debate last year? Is it Breece Hall or Kenneth Walker? Which one is the best? Mm-hmm. This year, I think we're going to be having a very similar conversation about Trayvion Henderson and Bijan Robinson. I do.
Yeah. Trayvion's the type of big play threat too. Like he's going to bring off some big runs where, like similarly how you talk about Chris Tyree, like, I mean, there could be some games where they're just playing inferior opponents and he could have 8 carries for 100 something yards. You know, like that's very possible. So to back up your yards total on the season, like he might not have to be a high volume guy. Like it might not take him 25 carries to get to $120, like,
well, I mean, to your point, he had 277 yards against Tulsa, had 24 carries. I mean, that's a lot of carries, but like he's over 10 a pop. Most people need like 35, 40 carries to get 277, and then the next game he goes for 8 for 93 against Akron, 8 for 71 against Rutgers, 9 for 81 against Indiana. He had a lot of those kind of games. You saw his volume amp up late in the year, which kind of his production tamped down because they played a little bit better competition second half of the season. And like I said, the line was strong. Look, there's a reason that Ryan Day got rid of his line coach. Yes. And it wasn't just because, he didn't like Coach Stud's bald head. I mean, there's a reason why he did it. And it was because he knew that the run blocking wasn't good enough. And it's going to be a big line, and it's going to be a line with some talent, as we'll get to when we get to the offensive line production. But he's the kind of kid, like you said, like Chris Tyree, that doesn't necessarily need a lot of touches to happen. So Ryan, you just got like super bright over there. I don't know what the heck happened there. Yeah, you look like there was like an angelic host was in front of you lighting up your room. So, but we're back we're good now. Let's go to receiver and let's just get the trifecta over with. There's really no question about it that the best receiver on Notre Dame's schedule, in my opinion, is Jackson Smith-Njigba, who is one of the best receivers in the country. Production was brilliant last year. I don't know if he'll repeat that production. Simply because teams are going to be able to focus a little bit on him more, like they kind of did Garrett Wilson last year, and I also think that I don't know if he's going to have he had a couple games last year that really boosted his stats way up. Doesn't take away from his brilliance. It's just when he is the focus of the offense, is he going to have the 15 for 240 he had against Nebraska? Is he going to face defenses that are throwing their running backs out at corner like they did in the Rose Bowl? I just don't see that. But I actually think he's going to be a more impactful receiver this year because he is going to be the guy. He's going to be the one they go to in those big moments like they did Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave last year. So even if his production doesn't match last year's for whatever reason, I think he's going to be a better player. And he's going to be one of the minimum 4 to 5 best receivers in the country. I mean, I look at him. I look at the kid from LSU who's in that conversation. Jordan Addison's in that conversation. There's some really good receivers this year. But if you're having the best receiver in the country conversation, Ryan, and you don't include Jackson Smith-Njigba in the conversation, then I don't think you understand what makes a good wide receiver.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's a really good player, man. Like he's a high volume kid. You know that he, especially with the playing majority of the reps in the slot, at least last season, he's a guy that has gotten CJ Stroud's absolute trust, working the short to intermediate game, working the RPO game. And he actually did more after the catch last year than I originally remember, Brian. Like he made some big plays after the catch last year. There's going to be a conversation about how translatable that is from college to the NFL. But as far as a college receiver, man, like he is he's dynamic in his role as a slot receiver, strong hands, really good route runner. It was a no-brainer. I mean, the production backs it up, the impact backs it up, and he's just a really good football player.
There's another kid that you and I had a consensus on, and that is Joshua Downs from North Carolina. He is a kid that, in my opinion, is not getting enough respect as a big-time football player. You know, he doesn't have that secondary weapon to take pressure off of him the way that some other receivers did. Anybody in this room ever heard of Antoine Green? I didn't think so. That's the guy that North Carolina was relying on to take pressure off of Joshua Downs last year. 101 catches, 1,335 yards, 8 touchdowns. This is a kid that I think is there. I think the overall offense is going to be a little better this year than it was last year. Though last year they put too much on Sam Howell. I think this year you're going to see a little bit more of a balanced offense. I think Josh is going to maybe see his catches go down a little bit, but his yards per catch go up and have a really big year. He's a really talented football player, in my opinion, and did that without really having the kind of supporting cast that a lot of other receivers in the country had. And the other thing too, Ryan, is we talked about, like Jordan Addison and some of the bigger games didn't have the big production. I can't say that about Josh Downs. He had 10 catches for 142 yards against Notre Dame. You had 8 catches for 203 yards against Virginia. Even when the offense was struggling, he went for 8 for 123 against Virginia Tech. You had 8 for 95 in the rain at Pittsburgh. So this is a kid that, to me, he was not the reason their offense sputtered at times last year. This is a really good football player.
Well, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Brian, I consider kind of the technician and the dependable type of player, right? You always count on a Jackson Smith and Jigba. Josh Downs, the word that comes to mind is dynamic. Like whether that is after the catch, working down the field vertically, uncovering downfield, like he's a lightning in a bottle, man. And the last guy that on my list is also a lightning in the bottle that we'll get to in a second. But I love Josh Downs' game, man. I think there's more nuance to his game too than you would give him credit for, because he was just like really a first-year contributor. I know he played a little bit as a freshman, but for the most part, he was kind of thrust into duty, because if you remember last year, the leading returning receiver from the year before was Bo Corrales, who got hurt last year. And I think he transferred to a different school this offseason. I forget where he transferred to, but I didn't know much about Joshua Downs. I didn't. And then you kind of see him and you're just like, man, this kid can separate in any level of the field, and he's dynamic and he's explosive. And I mean, he was a problem against Notre Dame, man, because he is just such a good football player. So I was so happy to get him on the list. I thought it was a no-brainer for me, at least, if we had 3 wide receiver spots, to get him on the list, because I would put him in the conversation of the most dynamic player on the list just in general from a playmaking perspective. He can affect the game in so many different ways, Josh Downs.
So let's actually have that conversation real quick. I think that there's 2. I think there's 2 players, and in my view, just separate themselves from everybody else as just playmakers. For me, it's him, Josh Downs, and Trayvion Henderson. Those are my 2. Those are my 2. Because you said different ways. You said different ways, right? So that Jackson Smith-Njigba is a phenomenal receiver, but I'm not worried about him. He's just a receiver. Trayvion Henderson is a guy that can run the ball, can catch the ball. If you want him to be your kick returner, he could be that. You mentioned how Josh Downs can hurt you in so many different ways. Those would be my 2 that I would put in there. And is your third guy going to be your next receiver?
Yes.
Okay.
It is. Yes,
let's go to the third receiver, because this is where we had a little bit of a disagreement, and I'll explain why we disagreed on this one, because I really wanted to go with Ryan on this one. So your number 3 receiver is
Zay Flowers, wide receiver from Boston College. The complex that I had was, and I know people are in the chat probably already or going to later on, comment and say, how could you not put the Biletnikoff Award winner on your list, Jordan Addison, now at USC? And I get it, folks. Trust me. I understand. This was my internal debate. We are projecting towards the 2022 season, right? And I think with a healthy Phil Dracote for the whole year, because if you go look back at the start that Zay Flowers had last year, he was off to a great start until Phil got hurt. And then after that, I mean, Brian, I was watching games where he was uncovering everywhere on the field, and yet they just could not get him the football, man.
Right.
He had
You're talking about when
yards.
the other kid was a quarterback?
Number 6. When he was in the game, nothing was happening, man. And there were several deep balls where he's wide open and they just could not get him the football. Zay Flowers, should have had well over 1,000 yards last year.
Easy.
It was just moderate quarterback play. It was not great after Phil got hurt. And then when Phil came back, it still wasn't good, because Phil should not have been playing down the stretch. If we're being
he just
honest.
could get nothing on it, but he just could make plays still. And that's why they needed him back. And that's why they won games even when he was out. or when he came back is why they still went, because they weren't going to win. They weren't going to go 2-2 down the stretch if Phil doesn't play. That's just a fact. And that's why they brought him back.
And I just think similarly to Josh Downs, Zay Flowers is a kid that I think can work after the catch. And he's even better after the catch than Josh Downs, to be honest. Like he is got some crazy vision in the open field, man. So like RPO game, screen game, get him in space and let him work. And then also, I mean, that kid's got to be a legit 4.3 something athlete, man. Like he can uncover deep so well. So this is a multi-level threat and a dynamic football player. And if Brian wanted me to go with Jordan Addison, I wouldn't have pushed back too much on it. But Brian, then I would have made you make like an all-purpose player spot. So I could have gotten Zay Flowers on the field, man. Like
he wouldn't have made me do it. You just would have done it. You said, "Hey Brian, real quick before defense, I just want to create something. We're going to go Zay Flowers," and I would have understood it. So here's my thing, Ryan. If you're saying, "Hey, who would you want on your team?" Honestly, I'd probably pick Zay Flowers. To your point, I think that there's no question he would have had 1,000 yards last year if Phil doesn't get hurt. It just the difference in production is so great. For context purposes, the first 2 games of the year, he had 9 catches for 203 yards with Phil in the game. And then okay. That's kind of how it would have gone. And then Phil, still had a 2 catch for 87-yard game with Phil back, had a 3 catch for 92-yard game with Phil back. Because the thing that Phil can do that the other kid couldn't do is throw bombs.
Yes.
And that's the thing is he doesn't need 100 catches to get to 1,500 yards. He's going to be a big yards per play guy. But the production difference was so significant that I just can't justify it at this point in time putting Zay on there. I don't disagree with anything you just said. And if I was picking a guy for my offense and I'm just running, I would want Zay in the slot for me because I could also put him outside. I can do a lot of different things from him. I can run jet sweeps and do a lot of things with him that to me, he's like an even more, dynamic version of Braden Lindsey. What we talk about what Braden Lindsey can do, but Zay has shown he can be a volume guy as well. He's had, 50 catches. He had 44 last year. He had over 50, I think the year before with Phil. And I think he played like 10, 11 games the year before. So just the production is just, Jordan Addison had over 100 catches, over 1,500 yards. My issue with Jordan Addison and why this wasn't an easy call for me is because I do think some of his production was a little bit inflated last year, if I'm being honest with you. 6 catches for 124 yards, 3 touchdowns against Western Michigan. 6 catches for 179 yards, 3 touchdowns against Georgia Tech. He had 6 catches for 117 yards against Georgia. I'm sorry, the 6 for 179 for 3 touchdowns was against New Hampshire. He had 6 catches for 117 yards and a touchdown against Georgia Tech, who was terrible on defense last year. Just absolutely terrible. It's a team that gave up 100. Last year they gave up over 50 points to Pitt. They gave up 48 points to Virginia, 33 to Miami, 41 to Boston College, 55 to Notre Dame, 45 to Georgia. It's just kind of like, well, they're terrible. And he had, good numbers against them. But, I wasn't impressed, with that. And then, played some of the better teams in the schedule. 5 for 84 and a touchdown against Clemson's good. That's a good day. 7 for 171 against Duke, who's terrible. 14 for 202 for 4 touchdowns against Virginia's secondary, which was terrible last year. Then he goes for 11 for 81 against Syracuse. I would argue that was the best secondary he played last year, and all he did was catch now screens and quick throws. That's it. He could not separate deep against Syracuse last year. And then Wake Forest's terrible defense, 8 for 126. And then against Michigan State, who had literally the worst pass defense in the country last year, like literally the worst pass defense in the country, he goes 7 for 114. So I'm not trying to take away at all from the fact that he's a good football player. And just for the record, some of those teams I mentioned, Michigan State ranked 130th last year in pass defense. Duke ranked 129th last year in pass defense. Georgia Tech ranked 121st last year in pass defense. So, I think the point has been kind of made that they did not play anybody really good. There's secondary.
There's a common denominator that he torched a lot of bad
defenses. Now, that doesn't mean he's not a good player because there's a lot of people that wouldn't have had 100 catches for 1,500 yards against that schedule, right? So this isn't to say Jordan Addison's not he's a really good receiver. And just production-wise alone, he's in that conversation for top receivers in the country. It's just are you going to put him in an offense where he is the guy and not a lot around him against big, the best teams in the country? And is he going to be able to go out there and make those plays? I just don't see it. Now, he'll put up good numbers again this year at USC because he'll actually have some support. And he also played with arguably one of the best not arguably, he played with one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year too. He's going to have that again this year. As you said, Zay played half the year with a very subpar quarterback compared to other people. And then the last 4 games with a kid who's really talented but was injured, who broke his hand, his throwing hand, by the way. So I think for me, that's kind of why I got to go with Jordan Addison, but I don't feel great about it. And I feel that's a little disrespectful to the kid for the production he had, but I'm just being honest. It won't shock me if Zay Flowers is the more dynamic player this year. No matter what the numbers tell us, it won't matter.
Brian, can I backtrack to Zay for 1 second?
Sure.
Because I have a great Zay Flowers story. So it was not before this past season. It was the season before when Zay had his breakout year, 50-something catches for over 800 yards, whatever it was with Phil. I actually talked to the director of player personnel at Boston College for some NFL draft insights. Okay. And I asked, is there any wide receivers or anybody else that we should talk about that I should be on my radar? And Brian, he said, no, we don't typically recruit very well at wide receiver. We don't have a ton of speed at that position. And then that same season, Zay Flowers comes out of nowhere. And I'm like, you lied to me, sir. You lied to me. You knew Zay Flowers was there and you did not give me the heads up on Zay Flowers. So give him his respect, man. Give him his respect.
Yeah, he's a good football player. He's a good football player. Tight end, Ryan, let's get back to being on the same page. Tight end, we are on the same page, and that is Benjamin Eurosec. There's not a lot of great tight ends in the schedule this year, but it wouldn't matter to me. He's going to be in that conversation. We saw it firsthand last year. Notre Dame saw it firsthand last year when he had a really good game against Notre Dame last year with a completely depleted receiving corps around him. This is a kid that Notre Dame recruited to play defensive line. And he goes out at Stanford last year with supporting cast beat up, has 43 catches for 658 yards, only played 11 games, 5 for 87 against Notre Dame, 5 for 64 against Cal. Those are 2 really good defenses that he did that against. So you talk about, and he didn't really become a key part. I mean, he had 4 catches for 30 in the opener, 1 for 10 against USC, 2 for 47 against Vanderbilt, didn't play against UCLA, 3 for 41 against Oregon. That was the first 5 games. Then he broke out against Arizona State and he went 6 for 118 against Arizona State, then 5 for 99, 6 for 93, 4 for 42, 2 for 27, 5 for 64, 5 for 87. That's what we're going to see from him on a consistent basis this year, in my opinion. Yes. And he's going to have a really good season. He's going to be one of the 10 best tight ends in the country this year, in my opinion. There's no doubt. He's an athletic kid. He's a big kid. He can block a little bit. He's a really good pass catcher and a really good athlete. I expect big things from Ben Eurosec this year.
I could not agree more, Brian, with how you phrase that. It's like, yes, there was not really another clear option after Ben Eurosec, but really good player, man. I mean, he's got length. I'm assuming that he's going to add a little bit of size this year because I think he was only listed at 230, 231 pounds, something like that last year. But I mean, that play against Notre Dame, it was a bad angle by Xavier Watts, the long touchdown. But then you're like, oh, but when you get in open field, man, he's got a little speed to him. He's a really nice athlete for his size, and they're going to depend on him a lot because, I mean, they have a couple of receivers like Michael Wilson, who's a solid player, and Elijah Higgins, who has some talent, but Benjamin Eurosec is the clearest top option in that passing game coming back, at least from a consistency perspective during the second half of the year last year. So I'm excited to see Benjamin Eurosec because there's a lot of good tight ends in college football this year, man. It's a pretty nice little list, but I agree with you. Ben Eurosec deserves to be talked within the top 10 tight ends in the country because he just had a quietly really good season for a team that struggled in a lot of areas.
Yeah. Let's go offensive line, Ryan. And this one was tough because there's some guys moving positions, there's some projection. And honestly, interior offensive line, it's not a great year nationally. So it was a little bit challenging to find some guys. We actually agreed on the 3 interior guys. I had a little bit of a disagreement at tackle. So let's start from the center out. And that way we can kind of work through it. Number 1, there's a couple decent centers on the schedule. Luke Whipler's probably the best of the group. I think the reason I went with him is Brett Nealon was a really good pass protector last year, but didn't show me a lot in the run game. I think Luke Whipler is a better all-around player, not special. I could see Brett Nealon maybe taking that over this year, maybe, but they're both solid players. Neither are special guys, but I'm going with Luke Whipler because I think he's a steady, tough kid that is gonna now that he's got a lot of experience, is gonna be a real consistent anchor to that Ohio State offensive line.
He's not a guy that I would predict on being the best Ohio State offensive lineman because there's guys with much higher ceilings than Luke Whipler.
Right.
But Brian, last year, in my opinion, I think he was the most consistent offensive lineman they had. I mean, he was kind of a steadying force because Harry Miller was supposed to be the starting center. Then he has to go out, unfortunately, with everything that he was dealing with. And I thought Luke Whipler played pretty well last year, man. Like for a redshirt freshman, I thought he did some really
He's just
nice
not a
stuff for
sexy
Ohio State.
player, right? Like he's not that kid that's going to come off and blow people 10 yards off the ball. You just watch him play and you're like, kid just does his job every snap. And isn't that kind of what you want from a center? You know what I mean? Like you want a guy, the center more than anything else, a center has to be dependable.
Yes.
You just got to be able to, he's going to get the ball where he needs to get to, and he's going to block where he needs to get to every snap. And that's what Luke Whipler is. I mean, again, he's just a steady player. And there's not a lot of that on the schedule. There's not a lot of centers that bring that. There's some guys that are bigger and stronger and a little bit more powerful in the run game. And, I think you could maybe argue that Brett Nealon maybe is a little bit better pass blocker, but this is a kid that just is going to go out and do his job every snap and be a solid player. And there's a lot of I would not be as high on that if we're talking guard or tackle. I want a little bit more dominance there, but at center, I just want a guy that's going to go do his job and do it snap after snap after snap. And to me, that's why Luke Whipler was my center on this one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you said, you can make a case for Nealon from USC. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But other than that, man, like the Millette kid from Marshall was a good player, but he graduated, obviously. I know we talked a little bit about.
We're not talking about Marshall offensive lineman in today's show.
I also know that Nugent was a kid from Stanford that you talked a little bit about. I know
he's another good pass pro guy. Again, he's another really good pass pro guy, but they are so bad at run blocking. I couldn't justify putting. I mean, if we're going to talk about just talent, I got 2 Stanford guys on my on this list.
Yes.
Like seriously. Pick one of their tackles, and he's on this list just on talent.
Yes.
And Drake Nugent's a guy that I'm like, that's a kind of talented kid, but they're so bad at run blocking. I mean, just so bad at run blocking. I'm gonna give you all the stats because I just want people to understand this. So Notre Dame, we've talked about how bad Notre Dame's offensive line was at run blocking, right? We've talked about it a lot. So last year, Notre Dame, as bad as they were, averaged 144 yards per game rushing. Pretty bad, right? And 4.1 yards per carry. Really bad. Like for Notre Dame especially. Stanford last year averaged 86.8 rushing yards per game and 3.2 yards per attempt. That's bad. That's brutally bad. And I can't justify. And they're not it'd be one thing if they were like Washington State or Mississippi State, teams that just like don't run the ball. But that's not the case. They just stink at it. And, I can't justify it.
They wasted a little bit of talent at running back too. Cause I thought Austin Jones was a decent little player and he averaged like 3 point something last year.
Who's the other running back they had that transferred?
Pete?
Nathaniel Pete. They had EJ Smith, Emmitt Smith's kid, who's going to be their starter this year. Yeah. It's not like they lacked talent in the backfield.
Their offense in general actually has a decent amount of talent, man, but it's just not good.
They're just terrible. It really comes down to just the lack of they're just not tough.
Yes.
They're just not tough.
Because they have literally a quarterback that has NFL talents. I'm not going to say like he's definitely going to hold on in the NFL, but like we'll see. They have a couple wide receivers that'll get a look in the NFL with Elijah Higgins and Michael Wilson. They have an NFL level tight end in Benjamin Eurosec. They have 2 offensive tackles where, again, if you just like put them in a line, Brian, you'd be like, I want that guy, right? Like I want Miles Hinton to be the starting right tackle for my team. Like that's what they look like. And yet they were bad. They were really bad. So at that point, it's development and coaching, folks. Like that's the faults here. But
guard was easier. When Ryan tried to cheat and I didn't let him cheat.
I didn't try to cheat.
You even said I tried to cheat and put Paris Johnson at guard.
He was a guard last year. He didn't play tackle. I mean, what do you want to say?
So we went with Andrew Voorhees and Clark Barrington, and I think that's easy. When you just look at the guys who are going to be playing guard this year, Ryan, That's an easy pick. I mean, those are easy picks. Andrew Voorhees is a really solid, like we've had this conversation, like people talk about like top 50 overall national player and best interior guy in the country. I don't know about all that, but he's a good player. Has played out a position at times at USC. They try to put him at tackle at times. He's more comfortable inside. He's a good, solid, steady football player, especially as a pass blocker. Of all the USC linemen, I would argue he's their best run blocker as well. I would argue that.
Oh, easy.
I don't think it's I was gonna say I don't think it's really all that close. But that's easy. And I like Clark Barrington. I think, look, I don't know who coaches the O-line at BYU, but every single year they're tough, they're physical, and they're sound.
Yes.
And Clark Barrington is the best of that interior group after Voorhees for me. That was an easy selection for me for interior players.
Yeah, I mean, if I backtrack to Voorhees real quick, that was the easiest pick, honestly. Like, there's just not a ton of good guards on the schedule, for being honest. There's
not a lot of good guards in the country coming back this year.
Very true. It's not just a schedule thing. It's kind of all encompassing, I would say. Yes. Clark Barrington's a former walk-on, Brian. So I always like those kind of guys, man. He has developed. It's about as good as anyone could have predicted, because he was a walk-on at BYU, fifth-year player, and he's turned himself into a really rock-solid guard for BYU. So not a sexy name, not a guy that's going to be highly drafted, but just a college football player, he's a really tough, physical, good technique type of kid. Not a great athlete or anything. Nothing really stands out from a physical perspective, but he just is a good football player on his level.
Yep. Tackle, we had a little bit of a disagreement. We did have one similarity, though, and that is Blake Freeland from BYU. Another really good – who was the kid they had a couple years? It was Brady Christensen, right?
Brady Christensen.
They've had some really good offensive linemen and offensive lines recently. And I would say there's just not a lot of great tackles on the schedule this year, to be honest with you. There's not a lot of great offensive lines on Notre Dame's schedule, at least proven offensive lines, in my opinion. And Blake Freeland, to me, is a no-brainer for me at offensive tackle. There's going to be some people that are going to be upset that neither of us considered DeJuan Jones. I just don't think he's that good. I could be wrong. I don't think he's that good. Blake Freeland's a really good football player, a very steady football player, a physical football player, and he's big. He's a really big kid, and he can move pretty well for a kid his size, in my opinion.
High school quarterback and tight end, Brian. He came in at like 260 something pounds at 6'8", and he's got 35-inch arms, massive kid, and he's just really figuring it out, man. But he is a good athlete, and he has crazy length and really, really good pass blocker. Needs to improve in the run game.
Right.
There's some, he lacks natural leverage a little bit, and he's just a taller guy, but like good athlete, man. He's a really, really good pass blocker. I like a lot of what Blake Freeland is.
The other tackle we disagreed on simply because of the one guy that I went with didn't play tackle last year. Didn't even play on the left side of the line. That would be Paris Johnson Jr. I buy the hype that people have about him in regard to being a really good player, but I also understand where you're coming from, Ryan. He's got to show me he can play that position, and I agree with that. But when I just look at God-given ability, I think he's his combination of. I thought he played well at guard last year. He was. I would argue that Whipler was their most consistent offensive lineman last year. Johnson flashed the most dominant moments, in my opinion,
100%.
last year.
No argument.
He was young. So as long as he can now, I don't know if he's going to look like after the first game or two, he may not look like he belongs. I actually hope he doesn't look like he belongs on this list after the first couple games. But I think by the middle of the season at the latest, that Paris Johnson is going to kind of get into that groove, because he's not only going from guard to tackle, he's going from playing right-handed to left-handed, which is not as easy of a transition as people think that it is. So he may have some issues early in the season. I can live with that. By the middle to end of the season, there's going to be no doubt that he will be the best tackle on Notre Dame's schedule. When we look at just at the postseason all opponent team awards, I think he's going to be really good. Yeah.
Well, now, and Brian, this is why I wanted to try to get him on the list. It's just I haven't seen him play tackle. I get it. I mean, really talented kid. He's the most talented offensive lineman that we have on this list by a landslide. I ended up, because I wanted to give him a nod, to Matthew Bergeron from Syracuse, who I don't know if people have seen Matthew Bergeron. He's number 60, starting left tackle, Canadian-born player. He's really good, man. Like, he's a really, really good player. And I have not said that about a Syracuse offensive lineman in quite a bit of time.
Been a minute.
But yes, Matthew Bergeron is a really talented player, 6'5", 320, strong hands. He's one of the best offensive tackles in college football, and he just hasn't been on the forefront of people's minds because he plays for a Syracuse team that has struggled over the last couple of years with Dino Babers. But a lot of the reason that Sean Tucker was in consideration for us at running back is because of Matthew Bergeron. He is easily their best offensive lineman, really good football player.
I mean, we sat here and talked about how, Syracuse has the best running quarterback on their name schedule. They've got, I would say, the second best running back. Would you say Sean Tucker's number 2 on your list at running back this year? Yeah. I would as well. And that didn't happen because they couldn't block. Now, of course, Pro Football Focus has his run blocking grade way low, which is why they're terrible. The thing for me is I think he's a solid player. Mm-hmm. I just think the other 2 guys have more upside, more potential as I project forward, obviously. But I understand where you're coming from on that one. I would argue that we're not discussing some guys that have even without Paris Johnson. To me, it has first round talent. Yes. You would agree with that. We got to just see him play it. It's all we've ever said. We just got to see him play it before we project him onto an all. Ryan has said that you got to see him play it before he projects him to an all opponent team, which should be fair. Anyone that's objective and paying attention. Mm-hmm. But I would say that Walter Rouse, and it might be number 2 on my list as far as just God-given ability from Stanford, which even further project. And if you didn't want to go Walter Rouse, then maybe you might want to argue it's Miles Hinton.
I probably would. Man. That Hinton kid is silly talented. He's a silly talented guy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean that's the reality of it. Is just it just speaks to just how insane it is that team isn't better than it is on offense. It's just it's
gross, man. It's gross. We literally talked about 3 different offensive linemen that should be in the contention of this list, but
they're not.
And there's a reason.
They're not.
There's a reason.
It's wild. It's absolutely wild. So my list: Paris Johnson, Blake Freeland at offensive tackle, Andrew Voorhees, Clark Barrington at guard, Luke Whipler at center. The only difference Ryan had is Matt Bergeron at tackle over Paris Johnson because we just need to see him do it. Offensive wise, CJ Stroud at quarterback, Trayvion Henderson at running back, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Josh Downs at receiver, Benjamin Eurosec at tight end. The only difference we had in skill players was I had Jordan Addison receiver, Ryan had Zay Flowers, which I think both have very strong cases to work with this year. So that is our all opponent team, Ryan. We think that quarterback receiver are the best as a whole schedule beginning to end is the best 2 groups that this Notre Dame defense is going to face this year.
Yes.
So let's get over to the defense, and let's start with the defensive line because this one is very interesting. This might be the position we had the most disagreement. Sort of. There's 2 guys that we have no disagreement on. And there's a defensive end and a defensive tackle. They're both at Clemson. And that is Miles Murphy at defensive end. I think Miles is in the conversation for one of the best defensive ends in the country, pure defensive end. If you want to get into the debate of whether or not Will Anderson is considered a defensive end or not, that's the only reason I would say. If Will Anderson's considered a defensive end, then he's the best in the country. And then Miles and Isaiah Foskey and guys like that are in the conversation for number 2. But either way, this kid's a good football player. A really, really good football player. His stats are, it's funny. You watch him play, Ryan, and I watched him play a lot last year. And I'm thinking, man, this kid is a monster. And then you kind of look at his stats and you're like, 14 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 38 total tackles. You're like, it just felt like he was better than that last year. And I think that's the thing. You got to watch him play to really get an appreciation for how good this kid is. You really do.
I'll say this about the scheme, and obviously it's Brett Venables who's now over at Oklahoma. It's a really chaotic system. I like it to a degree because there's a lot of pressure that is applied to an offensive system. The gap on sounds, and I like a lot of the stuff in their scheme, Brian, but I also do think that they didn't take advantage of how good Miles Murphy can just be on a one-on-one basis. You know, like they're slaying him a ton, they're 2-gapping him some, they're working him inside at times. Just put him on the edge, man.
Yeah.
Let him play 5, let him play 7, and let him just go, man. Like he's just that type of dude where working from wider alignments, I think that just speed to power conversion. The length is silly. Like he's just such a good football player. And the stats should be a lot better than they are, but you could see we're film guys. So when you watch him play, they can't stop him. He's just that type of player. He's overwhelming.
Yeah. He is their best defensive lineman. And I know Brian Breezy gets a lot of the publicity and I'm not quite sure why, We both have him on our opponent list at defensive tackle for two reasons. One, there's not a lot of great defensive tackles on the Notre Dame schedule. There just isn't. At least not proven guys. Like we could go Talik Williams and, but he didn't play a lot last year. I think I actually kind of would be understandable that argument, but he's got to show me more. I went with another guy, but Brian Breezy is on both of our lists because of number one, his talent, just God-given ability, is so significantly greater than anybody else on this list. And number two, I'm projecting this year that he's going to have a breakout year. His production his first 2 years is not something that you should look at and say, boy, this guy's phenomenal. But he also, part of that's injuries. I mean, he had 6.5 tackles for loss and 4 sacks as a true freshman. And then last year, he only played 4 games, had 3 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. Was having a good start to the year, 12 tackles, good start to the year. But he was even banged up at the beginning of the year. He was never healthy last year. So this is a pure projection pick for us of having Brian Breezy there. And the projection comes from this kid is absurdly gifted talent-wise. He's just got to stay healthy and put it all together.
Brian, there's times where they put him on the edge and he bends the outside track
at
like
6'5", 300 plus.
End. Yeah, he is you want to talk about just pound for pound best athletes on this list? It's probably Brian Mercier. Like he is just a silly athlete, man. Like they play him anywhere from shade nose all the way out to like 9 techs sometimes, man. Like he's playing everywhere for Clemson. And no, we haven't seen the best of him yet. But I'll say this is a style comparison. This is not saying that this guy is going to have this impact in college to this degree, but he plays a lot like Ndamukong Suh, a lot. I'm not saying that he's going to be Ndamukong Suh in college, but just from a physical strength perspective and just having some silly flexibility for his size, the kid has special gifts, man. He really does. You could tell me right now that Brian Breezy is a top 5 player in next year's draft, and I'd be like, I got it. I get it.
Yeah.
I completely understand. He's as physically gifted of a defensive tackle as you'll see that's gone through college the last few years. It's just about staying healthy and maximizing his gifts. He's another player where I don't think Clemson, when he's been on the field, even has used him properly all the time. I think that he's got a lot more upside as a penetration style player. If he hits, man, he is a special athlete.
I think we're actually going to see more of that this year. Based on what I saw in the bowl. Now, again, this is just a bowl game, and I don't put a lot on bowl games. And we've talked about this with Notre Dame and their bowl game, and I feel the same way about all bowl games. But it just seemed to me like they were still blitzing in different things, but it just didn't seem like it was as intense as it was under Venables. And I worked under Venables. And it was, the system worked not because it was sound, but because he knew how to make it work. Like I would not recommend, recommend other coaches doing what Brent Venables did. It was unique to him.
There is a person that does it, and it has not been successful. What is the guy? Alex Grinch is the same type of style, and it has not worked.
Well, John Tenuta tried to be that way, and I never thought his defense was that good. And whenever he played in leagues that were actually good, he wasn't good. So yes, I agree with you. I mean, Venables is just kind of like the air raid. There's people that try to do what Mike Leach does, and it just doesn't work for them the way it does for Mike Leach. I mean, so if you're a master of something, then you'll be successful of it. Let's do the other two positions because this is one that's a little bit more challenging. The second defensive end, honestly, you went with let's just go with your pick.
Yeah, I went with Tyler Beatty, who plays at BYU. He's a really long kid, 6'5", 270 pounds. He kind of plays a little bit between a even and odd man front in BYU system, but he's a very disruptive football player. And he had some production last year, but I think he's really going to break out. So that's the guy that I just didn't want to make it too redundant with this list. And I wanted to give him some play because he's a really underrated football player, in my opinion.
I got to see more from him. His numbers didn't knock my socks off. His film, I mean, I see where you're coming from, like looking at it from like an NFL draft projection side kind of standpoint. I just got to see it more. I wasn't as blown away by him, but I also am like, I don't know who else to put on there. I'm not going to make this an entirely Clemson defensive line thing because I'd be lazy. And, I want to go with one of the Ohio State defensive ends. I just don't know which one's going to break out as the guy. Is it going to be Jack Sawyer? Is it going to be JT? Is it going to be Zach Harrison? I don't know who it's going to be. Give me JT or Jack. Give me one of the rising sophomores, and that's my second end. I think one of them is going to break out, be a good player this year. Now, will he be a star? Remains to be seen, but at least he'll be a good player. And they could both break out and be good players this year. It's underwhelming.
Put your stamp, man. You got to pick one. You got to.
I'll probably go Jack. I'll probably go JT. It's probably my prediction and be the best because I think he'll be a little bit better. I mean, he's a power player. Jack's more of an edge rusher. I think as an every down run, and I think Jack may have better numbers, but I think JT is going to be the better all around player in my opinion this year. It's just my prediction. I think he's more just overall talented as well. So I like Jack Sawyer coming out of high school. I didn't buy the whole this is a top 5 national player kind of thing with him. Mm-hmm. I thought JT belonged in that conversation. So that's my projection. I don't feel great about the defensive ends. Defensive tackle, I feel more comfortable with. I went with Tui Pelotu from USC. He played end last year, and I thought he was out of position. He was a good year. He had a good year last year for USC, but I thought he played out of position. I don't think he's an edge player, and he played edge in sort of their weird 3-down type of defense. I don't know what USC was doing half the freaking time last year, but his production was really good. 48 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. I think he's going to play more kind of a defensive tackle type of role. He'll be on the edge at times, but kind of a defensive tackle role is what he's projected to play in that Alex Grinch defense for USC. I think they're going to turn him loose. I think he's going to be a good pass rusher. I think he's going to be productive. And he answers the bell every week. And that's why I went with him over Tyler Davis, because I just haven't seen Tyler Davis be Tyler Davis since his freshman year. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy. But I think, Ryan, you think there's a chance he's going to be healthy and get back to being that guy again this year, because he was on your defensive tackle list.
This was a tough one for me, Brian. First and foremost, I didn't watch Thule, so I didn't know enough about him, to be honest with you. My biggest question was, I think Malik Williams is going to be a breakout star. That probably would have been my pick if it wasn't Tyler Davis, but I just think that Tyler Davis, if healthy, because I'm not going to project him to be banged up again, but if he's healthy, I think he's a good football player, man. Like, he's rock solid. There's nothing sexy or flashy about him, right? But he's not the biggest guy in the world, but he just plays with good leverage. He plays hard. And I mean, he's had moments where he's been one of the maybe the most consistent defensive lineman on Clemson over the last few years when he's been healthy. I know it's been few and far between, but I think that if he's able to put a healthy season together, I think Tyler Davis is a really rock solid defensive lineman. And I think he's an invaluable player for Clemson's defense, because he also has that leadership quality stuff. Yeah. So I do like Tyler Davis as a college football player. NFL draft is a completely different conversation, but I think he's a really good college football player when healthy.
I wish he was back to being the guy he was as a freshman, because as a freshman, he was really good. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy the last 2 years. So, but I'll tell you what, if he gets back, if you're right, not right, but if your projection for him is what it turns out to be, that's defensive line is going to be stupid. Just insane.
We're not even talking about guys like Xavier Thomas and KJ Henry.
Yeah, exactly. It's Xavier Thomas is hurt. Okay, that means I guess they have to start KJ Henry. Gee, poor Clemson. I don't know how they're going to.
I know. I actually watched KJ Henry, man. I'm like, he's not a bad little player. No, he's pretty good.
He was a little overrated coming to high school as a 5-star guy. He's not that, but he's a good football player. Let's go linebacker. We have one pick that is easy, and that is, speaking of Clemson, let's just get our Clemson. This is our last Clemson pick, so let's get our Clemson picks out of the way. Trenton Simpson, to me, is the best linebacker Notre Dame is going to face this year, and I don't think it's all that close, to be completely honest with you.
No. Brian, he plays. So last year he played the Isaiah Simmons role, right, in the 4-2-5. So he's playing in space a ton. He's 6'3", 230 plus pounds. This year he's going to play will linebacker in their system. So he's going to play in a more stacked position, and he's got some physicality, and he is incredibly athletic, man. They say he runs between 4.3 high and 4.2 low at that size, and he changes direction so quick, and it's some silly fluidness for his size. And he had some tackle for loss numbers last year. He had some sack numbers. I think that tackle number overall, though, is just going to just skyrocket this year if he stays healthy, man. He's a special athlete. Could be the first linebacker taken in next year's draft as well. He's that type of athlete. So I think he has a pretty good chance to be in the best linebacker in all of college football next year. I don't think that's unreasonable to project.
He's going to have a chance. There's no doubt about it. He's going to have a chance. We had another agreement at linebacker. That's Michael. It's Michael, right? Is how you pronounce his name? Mikel. Michael Jones from Syracuse. Syracuse has a very underrated defense, at least the back seven. Their front's a little bit, and that's where they kind of have some issues, is their front's not that great. but they have a really good, put it like this. We're going to do position group rankings, and Syracuse is the top group in one position and was at least in the conversation at another. And they were both on defense, which doesn't do justice to the numbers they put up last year. But I think that has a lot to do with just how bad their front four is and also how bad their offense was last year. But yes. Michael Jones, really good football player, really productive football player. Last year had 110 tackles and 60 solos. So he's not a guy that, when you see a linebacker over 100 tackles and he's got more solos than assists, that guy's a good football player. Because where you'll see is like, a guy had 120 tackles and he had like 50 solos and like 70 assisted tackles. He was the other way around. He was 60 solo, 50 unassisted. That's just a kid that's around the ball a lot. Just a lot. And he had 6 games last year, Ryan, with at least 10 tackles for loss, including against Clemson last year in a game where Syracuse's defense played phenomenal, had their best game of the year. He had 10 solo tackles against Clemson last year. He's a really good football player.
I actually met him, Brian, when he came out of IMG Academy. So I actually met him. We went down to the IMG Academy Media Day one year, and he was in the same class with Evan Neal and Noah Kane and that Nolan Smith and that group. And I thought Michael then was pretty underrated football player, which is why he ended up at Syracuse, right? But he's been a mainstay of that team for years now, and he's really athletic kid. Like, he moves well in space.
Yeah, he can run.
I won't call him a thumper, but like, he's just always around the football, man.
He's productive.
So, I mean, yes, extremely productive.
He's
he has
6'1", 220. He's not going to look like Manti when he arrives at the football.
No. But he's instinctually good football player, and he's a good athlete, man. He's just always around the football. It's just point blank to it.
Last year finished with 110 tackles, 13 tackles for loss, 4 sacks. And then the year before, in 2020, he had 4 interceptions.
Yes.
And he played a little bit different role, if I remember correctly, that year. But here's the thing, too, that I like about him, Ryan. He didn't have, like, games where, like, you're like, okay, yeah, you padded your stats in that game, dude. He had you could argue, maybe one game like that in the bowl game or the end of the season against Pitt. He had 16 tackles. He had 10 assisted tackles, but he still had 6 solos in that game to get to 16 tackles. But like the tackles for loss number, he had 13, but he didn't have a single game with more than 2.5. Meaning there wasn't like that game with 5 that, against Albany that pumped up his stats. I mean, the 2 worst teams they played last year were Albany and Ohio. He had 1 tackle for loss in each game. He had 2.5 against Rutgers, 2 against Liberty. He had 2.5 against NC State, 2 against Pitt. This kid's just a good football player, Ryan, and a productive football player. And there's something to be said for that. There's absolutely something to be said for that. The third linebacker, we had a little bit of a disagreement on. Not different disagreement, but difference of opinion on. Yours was
Payton Wilgar from BYU, another kid that was pretty productive last year. Just he's what BYU always trots out there at linebacker, man. Like, he's just outside of Fred Warner, they just always have these tough dudes who are decent athletes and are always around the football. That's Payton Wilgar. There's nothing from a physical perspective that like pops. Like, he's like 6'1", 6'2", 230 pounds. Just a tough football player, and he's a productive football player. And I wanted to include him in the list just because I think he's very underrated across college football. I think he's one of the better linebackers, or I should say more underrated linebackers in the nation. And after Trenton Simpson and Michael Jones, I was just kind of like, like you could have went a couple different ways, but like there wasn't a bunch of like easy slam dunk options. So went with Payton Wilgar from BYU.
I understand where you're coming from. There's not a lot of great let me rephrase. There's not a lot of proven linebackers coming back. I think there's some kids that could be good players this year on the schedule, and we'll get to some of them. Somebody mentioned one of them in the chat for Clemson. We'll get to that here in a little bit. For me, Ryan, I'm going with Jackson Sirmon, and there's a couple reasons for it. Number one, really productive kid. You look at last year as a sophomore, he had 92 tackles, 60 solos. So he had the same number of solo tackles as the kid that we just talked about from Syracuse, Michael Jones, but he didn't have as many assisted tackles for a host of reasons, and he played on a not a great defense last year, if we're going to be completely honest with you. But I think he's a big kid. He's a traditional Mike. Had 4 tackles for loss last year. He's a veteran kid. Played a lot of football in his time at Washington. And he's transferring to Cal, and this is partly why I have him on my list. Where I have him on my list. Number one, I think he's going to play in a really good defensive system. Like I said, he's a pure Mike linebacker. He's going to have a lot of production in that Cal defense. And the one thing I have said in recent years is Cal may not be very good, but they play really good defense, and they're tough and they're physical. And you know that the defense is going to be built around him because for two reasons. One, he's going to be their Mike. And number two, his dad's the defensive coordinator. Peter Sermon's the defensive coordinator. And what I'm not saying that like it's kind of funny, but like what I mean is nobody's going to know his game as well as his dad is my point, right? Like he's a good football player, but his dad's going to know his strengths and weaknesses as well as anybody and be able to put him in good positions. And I actually think Cal has some really good players coming back on defense. I have 2 Cal kids on my all-opponent defensive team, and they're just tough, hard-nosed. Their defensive line's not super talented, but they battle, they scrap. I think Jackson Sermon transferring to Cal for his last year is gonna result in him having a really big jump in production, assuming he can stay healthy, and he's just going to be a good football player. There's going to be sexier guys on the list, Ryan, but if I'm putting a linebacking core together, and I've got this kid at Mike, and I've got Michael Jones as my will, and I'm moving Trenton Simpson all around, you're going to have a hard time running the football on my defense. That's the way I look at it. You just are. And that's why I went with Jackson Sermon, because I think he's the pure Mike on this list. He's the pure Mike that they're going to face. And I think he's a good football player.
Yeah. Well, there's some other players on teams that probably have a higher upside than Payton Wilgar or a Jackson Sermon, but we're talking about production and kind of a cleaner profile to being a good football player. And I agree with you. I think one thing that people underrate is that, and we've talked about this before the show, Cal's offense has not been great over the last couple of years, but Justin Wilcox has done a good job of building a good defense there, right? So I think that when you see what Sermon's going to do, I think he's going to be a very productive football player for Wilcox in that defense.
Teams that play on offenses that bad usually, or play with offenses that bad, usually have a hard time stopping anybody on defense. And that's the thing I really like about what Cal has done is they get no help from their offense, yet they still go out there and play good football. They ranked 4th in the Pac-12 last year in total defense and yards per play. They ranked 2nd in the conference last year at points per game at 22.3, and they got zero help from their offense. I think they ranked last in the conference in offense. Let me just look that up real quick because I want to make sure that I'm accurate on that. They were near the bottom of that conversation. They weren't as low as you'd think because of how bad some other teams are. They ranked,
I was about to say
7th.
Washington had to be really low on that list.
Colorado was at 257.6 yards per game last year. That is so bad. Cal was at 385 yards and still finished 7th in the 12-team conference. Stanford was at 302. Those teams are so bad. They are so bad. Cal finished 8th in scoring at 23.8. How can you score 23 points a game and not be in the bottom 4 of scoring in your conference? That is so bad.
But think about it, though. You just mentioned like Colorado was abysmal. Washington's offense last year was terrible. I don't even know where they are on that list.
They're going to be a surprising team offensively this year.
Better this year, yeah.
I love Kalen DeBoer as an offensive mind. I really do. They have okay talent. They'll have Jalen McMillan. That's good talent, but I love him. Look what he did for Michael Penix.
Yes.
I don't think that kid's super. Yes, I don't think that kid's a super talented guy. I just think Coach DeBoer, I should say, knew how to use him, and he's as long as he stays healthy, he's gonna have a productive year. Let's go secondary. Ryan, you went with an all Ohio State secondary. The first one we agree on, Ronnie Hickman. We definitely agree on him. I think he's probably the best safety that they have coming back. I'm going to make a case for another guy potentially being that guy, but there's no doubt that Ronnie Hickman's one of the 2 best safeties that Notre Dame is going to face this year. Second one, however, we had a disagreement on. State your case for Josh Proctor.
I think coming into last season, Josh Proctor had the claim to being the best player in the Ohio State secondary, and then he gets hurt early on in the season. But I think that there's some solid production. I think he's a pretty good football player. I also think, Brian, that after Ronnie Hickman, I was just kind of like, oh man, there's not a lot of great safeties on this list, if I'm being completely honest. So it was like Proctor by default because I think he's a veteran player that's played spurts of good football, coming off an injury. But I think when you go back to 2020, there was a lot of positives for Josh Proctor. So I'm just kind of betting on that he's going to get back to 2020 for him because just not a lot to go off from 2021.
For me, 2020, I think Josh Proctor was a good player.
Yeah.
I just didn't think he was a great player. I thought that, he had 20 tackles in 7 games, had a couple games he got beat a couple times. and it was an all Big Ten schedule. And like we didn't really know kind of what he was. He's talented. I'll go with you there. He's got a lot to prove to me before I can feel comfortable saying, yeah, that kid belongs on, on any kind of all opponent list. But I also think it speaks to me. It just speaks to how thin the position is. Syracuse has a kid who's a good football player there, but not a guy that's going to be on my list. I think it's more about the Syracuse team, other than Garrett Williams in the secondary, is more about the sum is greater necessarily than the individual parts I think to a degree. But, for me, when I look at Proctor, he's got a lot to prove to me. And I get the talent. I do. I get the talent. I know he's a talented kid, but I don't know. I see a guy that's not necessarily he's just got a lot to prove to me. And maybe that's because I watched him against Indiana.
Resume.
Yeah. And he didn't look great. I didn't think he looked that great against Alabama, but he's I liked him coming out of high school. I did like him coming out of high school. So to me, the reality is, and we're getting some Ohio State comments down here from our Ohio State people. Number one, safety leading a team in tackles is not necessarily a boost to the safety as much as is an indictment on how bad the defense is. Yes. Number one. And then the other comment is we can't judge anything that the defense did with Coombs in charge. That's kind of the point, though. You can't just assume that because the new coach comes in that these guys are all of a sudden going to be great players. They got to show something. I mean, that's the reality of it. And it wasn't just the defense was bad. I mean, there were times where they didn't play well. So I get what you're saying, but that's the whole point, though. They got to show something, right? That's why we're not going to have a million Notre Dame skill players on the list, even though we think they're going to be good. They got to show us something, 100%. And that's how I feel about Ohio State. I also think that Ohio State fans tend to overrate the quality of their defense a little bit, and I should say the talent of their defense a little bit. My second safety is Daniel Scott from Cal. Now, what we have learned in this show, I'm taking a shot at Ryan here, but it's all in good fun, is that Ryan is one of those East Coast people that does not stay up late enough to watch the Pac-12. Because there are now 3 guys from the Pac-12 I have on my list that Ryan's like, I have no clue who that is. I'm joking, obviously, with Ryan. Daniel Scott, to me, is a really good football player. I mean, you're talking about a kid that had 60 solo tackles last year, led their defense. That says if you watch how they play, it's like Ronnie Hickman led the defense in tackles last year at Ohio State for 2 reasons. 1, the defense stunk. 2, they use him to come downhill a lot. Like he is that kind of safety that even if the defense is better this year, Ronnie Hickman's production is still going to be high. That's why he's a no-brainer on my list, because of how they use him. Like I would advocate if he played at Notre Dame, he's not a safety. If he played at Notre Dame, I'd probably put him a rover.
Well, I think an Ohio State person can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I thought I saw something that they're playing him as kind of that overhang in the 4-2-5, like or not
in
3,
some different
whatever
looks.
they play, 3 whatever, 3-3-5, whatever it is.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he's going to be productive in that regard. I think Daniel Scott's a similar player. And you talk about 60 solo tackles last year, had 3 picks, had a really key pick 6 against Northwestern. The thing I like about him, Ryan, is I've seen him make plays in 2 ways. The pick 6 against Northwestern was he just undercut a quick route and picks it off at like the 10 and runs it back for a touchdown. But then there's a couple picks he makes where he's playing over top and he's jumping a deep route, helping out and picking the ball off, getting over off the hash. And then, of course, he's a really sound tackler. Like when you look at his production last year, he had 60 tackles. He made a lot of open field tackles. He only had 22 assisted tackles last year. Ronnie Hicks, so Justin Scott had 82 tackles last year. Ronnie Hickman had 98 tackles last year. Ronnie Hickman had 54 solo tackles. Daniel Scott had 60. Ronnie Hickman played in 13 games. Daniel Scott played in 12. This is a really productive kid that's a good pass defender, can play off the hash, can play the post. It's not where I would use him, but he can do it. He's, to me, more of a cover 4, cover 2 corner in the pass game. And the reason I wanted to have him do that, because especially cover 4s, I want to have him coming downhill, playing in space. Really good tackler and a good cover player. Reminds me a little bit for what he did for Cal, a lot of like what Brandon Joseph did for Northwestern a couple years ago when they were really good on defense. Not as dynamic as Brandon Joseph, but very similar player. I like Daniel Scott a lot, and that's why he is on my all-opponent team.
Love
Cornerback Ryan, we were
Mm-hmm.
on the same page. The only hesitation I had is I still feel like Tony Grimes by the end of the season could be on this list. But I'm not. The other two kids that we're going to go with here are just too experienced, too proven for me to take them off to project someone else to be on there. So we'll talk about a couple guys that could be breakouts this year. But when you talk about the preseason all-opponent team, Ryan, there's two guys that to me are just clearly above everybody else at cornerback. So why don't you go ahead and explain who they are?
Yeah. So, I mean, I love that you mentioned Tony Grimes for a second, Brian, because again, if we're just talking about pure talent, he's probably on the list. But I went with Garrett Williams. He was the no-brainer out of Syracuse. He's been really good for the last 2 years. He was a little banged up last year, but still played, I thought, good football overall. And he's got decent speed. He's pretty flexible, changes directions well, smart football player. Like, I really like Garrett Williams, man. Like, he's just a good all-around football player. Whether you're a man team, zone team, he just plays tremendously on the back end for Syracuse. They have another corner who's decent as well, Deuce Chestnut, but Garrett Williams is a no-brainer for me. And then we went with Caillou Blue Kelly, who is the cornerback out of Stanford. He's another kid, Brian, for me. Talent-wise, he could be the best corner on this all-opponent team when it's all said and done. He is 6'1", long arms, really nice athlete. He can run. He can change directions. It's been really good in spurts, but then there's also some games where he just kind of disappears a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So he needs to be more consistent, but he's an incredibly talented football player for Stanford, which another talented football player that maybe isn't as good as he should be. Who would have thought from Stanford? So
it's insane. Garrett Williams, the last 2 years, has had 20 pass breakups the last 2 years. That's just breakups. That's not passes defense. That's just breakups. That's a lot of production. And I think it also says a lot about their secondary as a whole. And now keep in mind, those 20 pass breakups have come in 21 games because he only played 10 games last year. To your point, he was banged up last year. So to me, he's a really productive player. And again, there's not that one game that he's had 6 pass breakups. His career high is 3. He did that against Notre Dame 2 years ago. The end of the season against Notre Dame. Man. Last year it was 1-0-2, 1-2, 0-2, 1-1-0. Like he makes plays on the ball, and one thing I liked about him last year too, Ryan. He became more impactful in the run game last year than he was as a freshman. Yeah,
good tackler.
Yeah, in 2020 as a freshman, he wasn't bad against the run. He had a lot of production, but it's like he was a kid that needed another year in the weight room. You know what I mean? And it was the COVID year, so they couldn't have as much of that. He was a good tackler in 2020. I thought he was a really good run defender in 2021, as well as being a really strong cover guy. So I don't know if there's a better all-around corner in college football, to be completely honest with you, than Garrett Williams.
I mean, as far as just playing the position, him and Clark Phillips are the two best corners, I think, in college football. Because guys like Kaylee Ringo are going to be more highly coveted from an NFL draft perspective. But just as a pure college football player right now, Garrett Williams is about as good as you can get. And he's a good athlete, too. I mean, Brian, the first game I saw 2 years ago was against Clemson, where I don't know if you remember that year, but Cornell Powell was a good player for Clemson that year, man. He got on top of everybody, it seemed. And I mean, stride for stride, Garrett Williams could run with him. He could run with Amari Rodgers. Just a really good football player, man. Yeah. I mean, there's some things that you can quantify. I think he's going to run pretty fast. I think he's going to test pretty well, but he understands where he needs to be on the field. He understands how to leverage wide receivers and he's a really solid player.
The problem is he plays at Syracuse. And he's just not going to get the respect. And he is also the epitome of why I say I love Pro Football Focus from a data collection standpoint, but they are so terrible when it comes to just the other aspects of this game. So they have him as a mediocre player the last 2 years. So they're just pretty terrible. But anyway, he's a really good football player. I think Tony Grimes is a kid that could be on this conversation. I know the Ohio State fans probably think Denzel Burke should be in this conversation. He's just not for me. Denzel Burke was a good player as a freshman last year, one of the better freshman quarters in the country. But his production, we talked about this the other day. One thing I hear from Ohio State fans all the time: Denzel Burke's a great corner based on what he didn't give up a single touchdown last year. I'm like, he almost gave up 3 against Michigan. 2 he didn't give up because he yanked the guy and because he was Beatty pass interference, and then the other one, the guy beat him and he tackled him at the 1. You know what I mean? So I was like, okay, he didn't give up a touchdown, technically speaking. Denzel Burke's a good football player, but he's going to need another year to get bigger and strong. He's going to have it. So he, to me, I think his freshman year was a little bit inflated in regard to the actual production. I think it was really good for a freshman.
Yeah.
But I think there's assumption that he's going to make the big jump, and he might. He could be one of those guys that by the end of the year, we're having this conversation about. He just, to me, I can't justify putting him on this list now because these two other guys are incredibly proven and are also talented. But and then, of course, as I said, Tony Grimes, to me, just a God-given ability, is a guy that I could see being that kind of guy. And then RH said Jordan Hancock's the best corner on the Ohio State team. He just can't stay healthy, though. I don't think he's going to be – I don't think he's available to start the season for Ohio State.
Can I throw 3 guys out there, Brian, that I think are pretty good corners that deserve a little bit mention? I'm actually going to go with Ohio State for a second. If Cameron Brown could ever stay healthy, he's a pretty good player, man. I like Cameron Brown. He's just a good player. He's always hurt, man. He's just always hurt. But he's a good football player, in my opinion. And then Josh DeBerry from Boston College is a good football player. He's a small kid, a little bit undersized, but he's a good football player. And then Marshall has a corner, Stephen Gilmore, who is the younger brother of Stephon Gilmore, who's also a pretty solid football player. A little undersized. They named
one kid Stephon and the other kid Stephen?
They 100% did.
Please tell me they didn't spell the names the same way.
No, it's different.
Okay, good.
Steven.
Okay, that's cool. Then I'm cool with that. That's different. I thought they were going to spell them the same, just like one's O-N and the other's E-N. I was like, oh, please tell me they didn't do that. But the kid you mentioned before, DeBerry, let me ask you this. DeBerry. Yeah. If we were to say, hey, take out a linebacker, so we're going to take out Jackson Sherman, right? And because we're going to go our nickel package. We're going to take out Jackson Sherman, who's a big Mike. We're going to go to our nickel. Who's your nickel? Would it be DeBerry? Because he does a lot of that for BC. He does a lot of nickel for BC.
He would be 100% my nickel, Brian, because honestly, from an NFL draft perspective, I think he's one of the best nickels in next year's class right now. Like, he's a really good football player. It's just, he's not big. Like, he's like 5'9" and some change, maybe. Like, he's just not a big kid, but he's got really good quickness, mirror matches well, physical player. So I think he'd be really nice in the nickel as a force defender too. But I mean, just a matter of fact is, like, he's going to get out leveraged by some bigger receivers sometimes, right? Like, that's just going to happen. But he's good. He deserves mention on this list because he's honestly, I almost put him as my second corner, but it's again.
But he's not really a corner. I mean, he's more of a nickel. I mean, that's the thing. And so that's why
defensive back.
That's why I think it was at least worth mentioning that if we went to a nickel alignment for the all opponent team, he's on it to me. I mean, he is. And that's going to be the key for BC because they actually have some decent individual players this year. I think Jaden Woodbay is a good football player. There's some guys I'm like, that BC, but can they as a unit be better? That's the question. Because the problem for BC is they have some 5-6 guys are just good football players. The problem is the other 4 or 5 guys are just not that good. And they just lack speed overall as a defense. But they're coached really well, and they've got some really good individual players. How that group steps up this year is going to say a lot about it. So let's do this now.
Their other corners not that bad either. The Elijah Jones kid, like, he's a pretty solid football player. I mean, I agree to you. It's a few decent parts, but it's a master of none.
There's too many games where those kids have to cover for 5 minutes. I mean, it's just they can't. They had a really tough time getting pressure on the quarterback last year without blitzing. I think that's the thing that at times really did BC in when they played teams that could really efficiently throw the football. That's where they had some problems because you just can't cover all day. And the other thing too is with DeBerry specifically, if I know you can't rush me, I will be able to get matchups where I'm going to hurt Barry because I'm going to do something where he's going to have to cover somebody that's bigger than him and put him in matchups where I'm, throwing wide fades and just don't say, hey, I'm going to put Lorenzo in a wide fade and throw him a back shoulder because that kid's undersized and he's not going to get any safety help, but if all that stuff requires time because, and that's the thing that has hurt him at times is they just don't, at times those kids just have to cover too long. And that's going to be a key for BC this year. So let's just quickly go through this, Ryan, just the best position groups on the schedule, and then we'll do the all-opponent team. This is going to be very interesting. The backfield, it's Ohio State, and there's not a number 2. If there was a group, a team that I was going to say is number 2, it would, if we were going to do a number, so there's no close to number 1. I think there's more of a debate between who's 2 and who's 3, and it comes down to USC and Boston College for me are the 2 that I would have a debate about. Yeah. Because you've got Phil Dracovic and Patrick Garwo at BC, right? You've got Caleb Williams and Travis Dye and those running backs at USC. Who else would be in the conversation for you? Am I missing somebody that should be on there?
No, that was my So originally I was thinking Syracuse, but that is, when we're including quarterbacks,
backfield
that's where
includes
the
quarterbacks,
separation
right.
happens. Yeah,
Right.
that's where the separation happens. I think USC is I think USC is probably the one that I would pick just because, Caleb Williams, I think, is good. And I do like Austin Jones and Travis Dye for what they can do role-wise. And I think that they'll be hopefully in a better situation than they both were in last year, if I'm being honest, but we'll see.
I think that here's where it gets interesting. Number one, USC has more depth at running back than BC. That's where I think I give the edge to USC. And then, of course, we talked about the quarterback situation. I have Caleb ahead of Phil right now, but I could see Phil being in that conversation. The other thing is they both have major question marks on the offensive line. But right now, BC or USC at least has a couple proven guys in Nealon and Voorhees. And so that's why I go. But I think but my point is, by the end of the year, I think we could be having a conversation about this. But that's my 2 and 3. Because of, like you said, like if Rashim Ali was there, we could maybe talk about Marshall. If Marshall could have been in this conversation in the top 5 or 6 if Grant Wells and Rashim Ali were both back for them.
Sure,
they would have been in that conversation.
Someone said Clemson, guys. DJ Uiagalelei just threw 9 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. Like it's not a conversation right now. Does he have the talent? Sure. And Will Shipley's a very talented running back, and they actually have a decent backup to him and Kobe Pace. But I
think Will Shipley's going to have a very good year this year. I do.
I think so too. I do. He's a good player.
But I'm not a DJ believer. I'm just not. I've never been high on him. And then he didn't look good in the spring. Now I could say, hey, who cares about spring games? But the problem is in the spring we saw exactly what we saw in the fall, where he's trying to throw hitch routes and he's sailing them 8 yards deep into the sideline. Did you see that one?
Man.
Did you see that one hitch he threw in the spring game?
Literally to the sideline, right?
Yes,
and it was just over the guy's head.
It might not have been a hitch. It might have been a stop route, but it was like somebody caught it 3-4 rows deep on the bench. Oh my gosh, that is bad. Now maybe that changes and it's better, but I can't go there. I can't. And Garwo is more proven than Will Shipley. I don't
just ran for 1,000 yards.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's a good football player. They just need somebody to kind of step up and up front. That's going to be the big question mark for BC is what happens up front. But I'll tell you this, if we're talking about ranking these units on what they were last year, BYU would have been in the top 3 for me. With the kid that they had last year at running back, he's gone. Obviously, he's in the NFL now, but boy, they had a really nice dynamic 1-2 punch in the backfield last year for BYU, which is why they had 5 wins over Power 5 teams last year. So
wait, Brian, did we just overlook in this thing of Ohio State? Did we just overlook?
They were number 1.
Oh, we were number 1. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we forgot to mention that.
No. They had the number 1. They had the quarterback and the running back.
Yes,
there was no option for number 1. It was Ohio State's number 1. The conversation was, I said Ohio State's number 1, and there is no discussion about that. So let's talk about who's 2, 3, and 4. Yeah,
I missed that first step. Got it.
Yeah, we have the quarterback ranked number 1 on our list. We have the running back, but they don't have the best backfield. That would be one of those ones where all of you would have to hit the unsubscribe button because we'd be idiots if that were the case. But no, Ohio State's 1. We were debating who would be next.
Number 2
on the list. Yes, correct.
Yep.
Best receiving core. I actually think this is debatable. And here's where it is debatable. Are you going to go with proven production or potential? Because if you're going to go with proven production, I don't think it's debatable that it's USC. Because Jordan Addison can match Jackson Smith and Jigba statistically, right? More catches. I think slightly more touchdowns, fewer yards, correct?
Yeah.
I think it was 15-14 or something like that. I'd have to go back and look at Jackson Smith and Jigba's specific statistics. Let me actually pull those up here real quick.
I think Jigba only had 8.
He had 9. Yeah, he had 9. And Jordan Addison had 17. So that's a big jump. Jordan Addison had 1593 Jordan Addison had 1593 in yards. Jackson Smith and Jigba had 1606, so they're close. Jordan Addison had more catches. Now, the ball was being spread around more at Ohio State than it was at Pitt, right? But you've also got Mario Williams coming back at you from USC, not coming back, but transferring over from Oklahoma. He was a 5-star kid that, caught 30 balls for 300 some yards last year, which is more production than what the Ohio State freshman had. They also get Terrell Bynum coming in from Washington, who I think is a good football player. He's a kid that I think adds depth to that receiving core. He had 26 catches for 436 yards last year in only 8 games. He's a kid that I think is a good player. As a freshman in 2019, he had 31 catches for 368 yards. That kid's got almost, close to 1,000 yards career yards there. And then you look at the Brendan Rice kid from Colorado, who's to me probably
talented,
4th on that group as far as proof of production, but a kid that has some ability. He's a quality football player. Had 21 catches for 299 yards last year, 6 for 120 the year before that. Again, all that production is more than Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka and Julian Fleming, right? Significantly more. So if you're going to factor in proven production into this group, then I think you go with USC. If we're just going to go on God-given ability and talent and potential and project to this season, then I think that's where the case for Ohio State becomes very strong, because I think I think Jackson Smith-Njigba is a much better player than Jordan Addison, in my opinion. I think Marvin Harrison is the most talented of all the receivers on either team, of just raw talent, even including Jackson Smith-Njigba, just raw God-given ability. His production's not there, but you've heard me make this case at Notre Dame. I don't care about proven production in regard to saying, well, that guy can't be something. Will Fuller went from 6 catches to 1,000 yards in freshman to sophomore. Gold Tate went from 6 catches as a freshman to 1,000 yards the next year. I think Marvin Harrison has the most God-given ability. And then, of course, you've got guys like Emeka Egbuka. You've got Julian Fleming. You've got the incoming freshman class that's really good. So I think if we're going to go pure projection, I'm going with Ohio State. If we're going to factor in proven production, then I would have to go with USC. So I wanted to give fairness to both of those debates when we look at who's got the best receiving core coming back this year.
Yeah, I mean, I would be okay with either side of the coin. I went with Ohio State because I am projecting more. I'll be very honest about that. I also do think that, Caleb Williams is a good football player. I think he's going to have a really nice year, but you also do have CJ Stroud coming back, which doesn't hurt your cause. You know what I mean? And I do think also Ohio State's offensive line should be better than USC as well. So there might be some more time to throw
by
and
a
all
lot.
that good stuff. Yeah. Yes, by a lot.
But Ohio State's also going to play much better defensive competition than USC.
So true.
So if we're going to talk like statistically, there's just, but see, that's the thing that makes it fun, right? Is we can have a debate here.
For sure.
But the moral of the story is Notre Dame secondary is going to begin and then the season against a couple really good receiving cores. There's no doubt about that. Neither have great tight ends as of right now.
No.
That is the one thing that
I saw Cade Stover was named captain for Ohio State. So that was interesting. But
his
cousin's a good football player. By
cousin's
the way,
probably one of my favorite players in the 2024 class.
Every time I get a chance, I'm going to talk about Garrett Stover.
Yeah.
Anytime you give me a shot. So
he's probably one of my favorite. He might be my defensive version of Jaden Osbury this year. Like just that dude. I'm like, I don't, maybe there's other guys I'm going to rank higher, but that's just the dude you got to get, man. That kid's just a football player.
We're going to agree on him. We're going to definitely agree on him.
Yeah, there's no doubt. So best offensive line that Notre Dame is going to face. This one we had a little bit of a, it could go either way. We went with Ohio State because of just the raw ability, the raw talent. You're going to have, I think their starting left guard is going to be Jackson, right? I believe he's going to start at left guard if I've heard that correctly.
It's going to be Jones and Jackson.
Right.
I can't remember.
Matthew Jones at right. I think Matthew Jones is at right guard, and I think Jackson's at left guard. I believe. Or not,
you could be right. I can't remember.
Hold on a second. I always get him confused with the Campbell kid, and I think it's Jackson. I always get him and Devin Campbell confused.
Donovan Jackson's the one that's going to start because
Donovan Jackson. Okay, I always get him and
fans are jazzed over Donovan Jackson right now.
Okay, so him and I think it's Devin Campbell, the kid that went to Texas, are two kids whose names I constantly get confused. Devin Campbell was in Texas's class last year. Donovan Jackson, Ohio State. I always get those two kids confused.
Gotcha.
Donovan Jackson's left guard, Luke Whipler at center, DeJuan Jones, who I don't think DeJuan Jones is that good, to be honest with you, but he's still a solid player at least. But I think he's the fourth most talented guy, maybe fifth most talented guy on their offensive line. So the talent's there. It's just how quickly can Justin Fry get it together and find the right combination. But I think it won't take long for Paris Johnson to be an upgrade over Nicholas Pettit-Frere because I just don't think he was very good last year. Agreed. I don't. I think their line's going to end up being pretty good. I've said this before. If you look at just the Notre Dame-Ohio State matchup, I think Notre Dame matches up very well for a lot of different reasons. But what I've also said is once you get out of September, I think Ohio State's going to be really hard to beat because I think their offensive line, the more experience it gets, as you kind of get the new young receivers kind of up to speed, as the defense gets more experience running Jim Knowles' system, I think by the end of the year, like if you haven't knocked Ohio State out of the playoffs by November, you're not going to.
Right.
I don't see it. Like, and that's the thing is like if you're going to get them, it's going to have to be early. And unfortunately for the Big Ten, I don't think there's anyone on Ohio State's schedule in the first 2 months in the conference that can beat them. Now, if you talk to Ohio State people, there's like 3 or 4 teams that are better than Notre Dame, which is just absurd on their schedule. I mean, it is just – I listened to a show yesterday. I listened to a show, and it's the host is someone who I have a great deal of respect for, and one of the guests just looked really uncomfortable with all the circle jerk that was going on that show with some of the people. But it was just like Notre Dame doesn't belong here, basically. Some guy was bringing up like some game that happened in 1996. Well, hey, the last time Notre Dame came to Ohio State, and I'm like, yeah, you had Orlando Pace, Eddie George, and like Notre Dame sucked. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what do we? Lou Holtz was the coach in that game. Like, what are we talking about right now? You know, they didn't belong there. But my point is that really, if Wisconsin or Michigan State don't beat them in the first 6 games, I don't see them losing a game in that league. Penn State's the only game that could be exception, and the only reason I say that is because Penn State, for whatever reason, just seems to play Ohio State tough. It doesn't matter how mediocre they are; they just battle Ohio State tough. But I just don't think they have the athletes this year on defense to stay with Ohio State, in my opinion. I just don't.
Yeah.
But
a lot of turnover on that defense.
Yeah, but I think after that, I think Notre Dame's really the only team that I look at and I feel that they have a shot to really athletically somewhat hang with Ohio State, and then have the talent in the trenches, and then have the dynamic playmaker quarterback. I don't think you're going to beat Ohio State this year with a drop back quarterback that just sits in the pocket and picks you apart. You're going to need a quarterback that can make some plays and put a team on his shoulders. I just think that's what's going to be needed. Let's go to I think the other team in the conversation, however, is BYU. I do think BYU does, because I think BYU's line is more proven than Ohio State's line. I just think the talent is where I go with Ohio State. But I do think BYU needs at least a mention as they deserve to be like. I mean, 2 of their starting offensive linemen are in our conversation or in our first team all opponent team look.
Right.
Defensive line. And do we want to talk about Stanford getting honorable mention for at least having the most talent, even though their offensive line is terrible?
If we're just talking about talent, then sure, we can always throw them into the conversation, man.
I mean, would you argue they have the second most talented offensive line on the Notre Dame schedule? Just God-given ability?
No, I don't think I would argue that. I'm just like thinking in my mind. I mean, I honestly could argue, and this is probably a hot take, I guess, but like Paris Johnson is incredibly talented, but I wouldn't say that he is incredibly more talented than like Miles Hinton is, if I'm being honest. Like, I think they're in the ballpark.
Yeah. And Walter Rouse has crazy tools, in my opinion, but just poorly coached. Let's go to the defense, Ryan. Best defensive line on the schedule. There's no debate here. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. It's Clemson. And it's not even like that's the best defensive line in college football, in my opinion. If they're healthy, it's the best defensive line in college football. Linebackers, we went with Clemson here. And a big part of the reason is not Trenton Simpson being the best linebacker they're going to face. It's what's around him. You know, Barrett Carter was a really talented player that I think is going to be a bit of a breakout player. That was mentioned in the chat as well. I think Clemson's linebacking core this year is not going to be as experienced or as it's been with like James Skalski and some of those guys. But I think this is going to be the most athletic linebacking core they've had in several years. Even you go back to like the 2018 defense, Trey Lamar was just like a 250-pound thumper. They had Isaiah Simmons, but their 2 inside linebackers, they were productive and good. Like Mike Jones, I think was Mike Jones. Did he start on that 2018 defense? I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I'm trying to remember who it was. It was Trey Lamar and somebody else.
It was number 34. He was Kendall Joseph.
Yeah, they were nice players, but like they benefited from having the best defensive line in college football that year in front of them, right? I actually think this linebacking core could be really good. You know, so
it's really this is. I mean, I don't think it's a hot take, Brian. Like you said, you had James Skalski last year. You had Balin Spector, both good football players, but like not incredibly athletic, right?
Great leaders and all that kind of stuff. But
all the cliche things you want to say about them, like they were those dudes. I mean, they were in the Ben Boulware type of talent level. We're talking about just from athleticism.
And Clemson's won titles with those kind of guys.
Sure.
I mean,
good football players.
Right?
Absolutely.
They won a title with Trey Lamar. They won a title with Ben
Yeah.
Boulware.
But I'll say this is whether it's Barrett Carter or it's Jeremiah Trotter Jr., whoever is like
or
the
Keith
Batman,
McGuire or
Keith McGuire. Yeah. Whether it's one of those guys, whichever one of those guys is the Batman to Trenton Simpson to Superman to let me rephrase. Whoever is the Robin to Trenton Simpson's Batman, I can't talk. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. It's going to be a really athletic linebacker crew. Like if you're second best athlete at linebacker is Barrett Carter, you're doing all right, man. You're in a pretty good spot there because Trenton Simpson is a freaky dude. Barrett Carter's a pretty freaky dude too. So, and Andrew McGuire's not a bad little athlete as well. So they got some athletes on that second level, no doubt about it.
No doubt. Where in the past it was one great athlete at linebacker with Isaiah Simmons, and then just good. Kendall Joseph was a decent athlete, but he was small.
Yeah.
Right. And Trey Lamar was not athletic. He was huge, which is why he didn't get drafted because he was not athletic.
He was a defensive end playing linebacker, man. It was so weird. So bizarre.
But it was fine because it was fine in that defense because they just, you couldn't block their interior guys. And he was just able to kind of thump and play between. They just let him, you're just a trash cleaner upper. You're just going to be a thumper in the middle. And they did the same thing with James Skalski. James Skalski was more athletic than Trey Lamar was.
Yes.
But not like I said, like what we're going to see this year. Like I said, even their backups. I would argue that Trotter's of the group's guys we mentioned is probably the lowest athlete on that group. Keith McGuire is really athletic. I just don't know if he's got to show me he's got the feel for playing defense, but he can run. There's no doubt about that. So best secondary, Ryan, this is where there's going to be some probably pushback from us, and that is going to be we're going with Syracuse as the best secondary. And that's going to surprise some people, but they got all their starters coming back. They have athletes and they can really play.
Yeah. They have, I would argue, Brian, that they may have the best, maybe not the best in the country, but one of the top cornerback tandems in college football. You have Garrett Williams, who's an excellent football player. We talked about him already. Deuce Chestnut last year was a freshman All-American. He had a really nice season last year. I don't know exactly what to expect from their safeties, but they have 5 guys that have played a lot of football coming back and a transfer, I think that's coming in as well. So, you could have went with Ohio State because they have more names, but if you're talking about just better football players right now, I think Syracuse has multiple guys that are better players right now than Ohio State has.
Well, and the one thing about Syracuse last year is their pass defense was actually the best part of their team last year. They ranked 26th in the country last year in pass defense. And they were, let's see here, they were around the top 50 in yards allowed per play or yards allowed per attempt. The problem with Syracuse, their pass defense this year is they've got to start making more plays on the ball. That's the one thing that I need to see from them is they got to start making more plays on the ball. But I will go with Syracuse on the secondary this year. I think they have a really good secondary. If they can get anything from their front seven, then I think this is going to be the best secondary. I'd probably put Ohio State 2. I think North Carolina's secondary is going to be much improved this year. I think they're going to have at least an athletic secondary this year. We'll see we'll see how things look after that. So next we're going to do, and we'll do this kind of once Ryan gets back, is we're going to go through and talk about where Notre Dame's players would stack up if we were to do an all opponent team. So until he gets back, y'all are just going to hear my picks. So for me, what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of look at the all opponent team, and we're going to say who would we take out and then add in if we were going to include Notre Dame. And I think there's some obvious ones that you're not going to do. There's no discussion at quarterback. There's no discussion at running back. There's no discussion at wide receiver. As much as we think Lorenzo Styles he's got a long way to go before we're talking about him in the Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, Josh Downs conversation, right? So we're not even thinking about that one. Tight end is a no-brainer. Michael Mayer's on that list. Here's interesting. How many of Notre Dame's offensive tackles do you take on this list? And which one, if you can only have one?
I don't think I would put them on the list right now, if I'm being honest. Okay. I don't think I would. I think that because again, it doesn't all pass production isn't the only thing that matters, but I also project Blake Freeland and Matthew Bergeron, at least in my opinion, and Paris Johnson included in this as well. I think they could all be one of the better offensive tackles in college football next year.
Interesting.
So, I mean,
I'm putting Blake
talent-wise,
Fisher on my list over the kid from Utah. I am. Excuse me, over Paris Johnson. Excuse me.
Oh, over Paris Johnson. Got it.
Paris Johnson was really good last year. I think Blake Fisher's a star. This has nothing to do with Paris Johnson. I just think he's a star. Now the conversation would be, okay, he's a right tackle. That's not we're not getting that into the weeds where it's left, right, that kind of thing.
Well, you wouldn't let me include Paris Johnson at guard, so maybe we should. I don't know.
No, it's a little bit different. I'm going Blake Fisher over Paris Johnson just because I think he's going to be a better player. But if somebody were to say, no, you got to keep Paris on there, he's more proven. Okay, that's fair. And now more proven at guard, but not at offensive tackle, in my opinion. I think you could also make a case for Joe Alt to be the guy because
Freshman
he is more proven. To your point,
and,
he's more proven and a really good pass rusher last year. I'm gonna go there.
Because I guess I care a little bit more about pass production. I guess I maybe shouldn't. So maybe this is a fault in my thinking. But I think if you ask me which one of the Notre Dame offensive tackles I would try to include in the list, it would probably be Alt right now over Fisher. Although I think Fisher is going to ultimately be the better football player. Joe Alt is just more proven, and also I think he's going to be very good. So it's like the combination is kind of where it gets tough.
Yep. Let's go guard. I think this one is easy as well. We would both keep Andrew Voorhees on the list, correct?
Yes.
And then we would replace Clark Barrington with Jarrett Patterson.
Yes,
right?
Is
that what it would be? I could see by the end of the year somebody could make a case. Maybe Zeke Correll breaks out and he's better than Luke Whipler based on what we've seen in the spring. But Luke Whipler is a very proven, even though he's young, he's a very proven player to me. Zeke Correll would have to play really well before we'd be talking about taking him out. And then if Jarrett Patterson was still a center, I would take him over Luke Whipler with all due respect. And then I put Barrington back, but we're projecting to what they're going to play this year. So I'm leaving Luke Whipler on my list. Again, we talked about earlier, really steady player. Zeke Correll's flashes are every bit as good as Luke Whipler's. The problem is Luke Whipler, from the moment he was inserted in that lineup, has just been a steady player. And Zeke Correll has been very much this, even as a center in 2020. And until he can be like Luke Whipler, it's that steady guy. I can't really have much of a discussion putting him here. And the only reason we're having the discussion is because we are a Notre Dame show and we're discussing the Notre Dame players and how they'd stack up.
Yeah, I agree completely. Jarrett Patterson's a no-brainer, whether it's a guard or a center. It doesn't matter. He's a no-brainer on this list.
So Patterson's a no-brainer. Michael Mayer's a no-brainer. I think the debate is the tackles, right? Yes. That would be where the debate is. Defensively, this is going to be an interesting one. The defensive end conversation is an easy one if we can include Notre Dame's guys and like Isaiah Foskey and Miles Murphy. That'd be one heck of a defensive end combination right there.
They're both very similar too, man. They're both stupid long and can play for multiple alignments. And that would be scary. Absolutely
I do think Miles is more of a natural power player. So or power end, I should say, not a power player, but a power end than Isaiah. So I'm not talking about how they play, but the position. So you put Miles at big end and Isaiah at Viper, in the Notre Dame defense. I'll take that. I'll take that all day. Good. With all due respect to Riley Mills. But I'll be honest with you, I'd take Riley Mills over some of the other guys that I had to consider for the defensive end position, but I'm not going to go there. It's Isaiah Foskey. Defensive tackle, I think, is also a no-brainer for me. It's Brian Breezy and Jason Adamiola for me. With all due respect to the kid from USC, it's those two are no-brainers for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely based upon the production from last year. Right. Like, again, I'm kind of projecting that Tyler Davis is going to get back to where he was. And, I mean, last year, Jason Adamiola was a better player because he just was available more than Tyler Davis. I mean, that's a point-blank period to it. So, yeah, Jason Adamiola would definitely be on our list.
Yep. Linebacker's an interesting one. I'm leaving Trenton Simpson and Michael Jones on there. There's
I wouldn't.
Like
Maris could be there, but like
he's got to prove it. He's got 20 some career tackles. I can't go with any of the Notre Dame linebackers on there. Even at Mike, where JD Bertrand was more productive last year than Jackson Sermon, but I think Jackson Sermon's production was more about, I say not production, but just more consistent, more steady. He was a Mike. He didn't have a lot of talent around him. I just kind of feel like, like their total production was kind of similar. If you look at it from the individual production, not the assisted tackles, but sort of the individual tackles. I mean, if you look at it, last year JD had 63 solo tackles in 13 games, and Peter Sirmon had 60 solo tackles in 12 games. Peter had 4 tackles for loss. JD, I think, had 7, correct? 7. Sack numbers are better. Pass game numbers are about the same between the two. I just think Peter Sirmon is a more natural Mike, right? More proven Mike, and JD is not. And so I could see JD or Maris being on there at the end of the year, but I just can't justify putting them on there right now because those other guys are more proven, and to me are just, I mean, you could take the 2 best games that Michael Jones had last year, and that's more career tackles than what Maris Luafau has for his career.
Exactly.
So talent-wise, go ahead, Ryan.
No, I was just going to say, Brian, like this is the talent comparison versus what we've seen comparison and what we can project easily. Because like you can project Maris being a dude, but like also you can also project that Michael Jones is going to have 100-something tackles. You know, like he's going to be a good player. Like it just
he already did that.
So,
he's already done that, exactly. Right? Exactly. I mean, so like if I were to say to you, Ryan, this year Maris Luafau is going to come out. He's going to stay healthy. It's the biggest thing. He's going to have 110 tackles, 13 tackles for loss, and 4 sacks. You're like, wow, that's a great year. Like, well, that's what Michael Jones did last year.
Exactly.
So, that's kind of where he's at for me. Now, that production would actually outshine Trenton Simpson, from a total tackle standpoint. But I think, to your point, I think him playing, I believe he's going to play more a little bit inside this year, correct? Well. So I think that's you're going to see his tackle numbers jump way up, in my opinion. 100%. I don't know if Trenton Simpson's going to have the same number of tackles for loss as he had last year, just because of how he's being used. He had 12 last year. He could. I'm not going to be shocked by it. But I think the sack numbers go down a little bit. He had 6 last year, 12 tackles for loss. But that's just more about a usage difference as opposed to he's not as good in those areas. But I wouldn't be shocked if he still has 12 tackles for loss. I mean, so those are the kind of things that you look at, Ryan, and you have to say, yeah, Maris could be really good, but those are 2 really good linebackers.
Right. If this was a conversation where there was just like a bunch of at linebacker in front of him, I would be like, okay, I'd be more willing to project. But the fact of the matter is that you have 2 proven football players in front of him, right? Like, I mean, it's just,
the question is, can one of those 2 guys outshine Jackson Sirmon? That's going to be the conversation at this point in time.
Right.
Safety, also a no-brainer. I think the debate you and I would have is who gets replaced. So both would have Brandon Joseph on there. I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're going to take away Josh Proctor, right, for him. I would take out Ronnie Hickman, to be honest with you. I would go with Daniel Scott and Brandon Joseph. I really like Daniel Scott. I think he's a really good football player.
I need to watch him, man. I need to get eyes on him.
Yeah, and corner, it doesn't change. For me, I think Cam Hart could be that guy. But Cam's got a lot to prove still, And the thing is, I think Cam's one of the 10 best corners in the country. I just think so is Garrett Williams and Caillou Blue Kelly. If I were to take Cam on one, it would be over the kid from Stanford, Caillou Blue Kelly. That's who I would replace if I was going to take Cam.
Yep, I would not touch Garrett Wilson. Garrett Williams would always be on my list. Caillou Blue Kelly is the guy that you can have a conversation with.
Yep, he would be there. So we would definitely do 2 of the defensive linemen. We definitely do Brandon Joseph. And like I said, Cam Hart's in the conversation. I had to think about that one for a while, but I still it's the proven nature of those other 2 kids over Cam. If by the end of the season, if Cam Hart is on my list, will we be shocked? No.
Absolutely
we won't be. Just like if one of the Notre Dame linebackers I expect actually one of the Notre Dame linebackers to break out and be a guy that by the end of the year, because somebody mentioned, I think it was Robert Bishop said, hey, we should bring this list out in January. That actually would be really fun. We'll probably do it in December because there's going to be more downtime. That'd actually be a lot of fun. So I hope that you all remind us of that. But if I were to say, hey, by the end of the year, will one of the Notre Dame linebackers be on there? I'd say, yeah, probably. I think so. But they got to prove it. They got to prove it. JD's got to prove to me he can play Mike. Maris has got to prove to me he can stay healthy. I mean, that's the big thing. But if Cam Hart has the year that I think he's going to have, I think he's going to end up being on this list. I do. But it's just a lot of projection for me.
I don't disagree. I mean, yeah, it is definitely projection. But, Brian, it's the most important part of the show. We got to do place kicker and punter. Who you got?
No, we don't. No, we don't. I'll tell you what, though, in all seriousness, though, that is one thing
Yeah.
that if you look at Ohio State and you talk about the matchups and the different types of things, and I did a show on this summer, and some Ohio State fans just lost their minds because I had made the case that if you just go position group by position group, I actually think Notre Dame has the edge in more position groups than Ohio State does. But I didn't do coaching, and I didn't do special teams, and I didn't talk. It wasn't like who's going to win the game. It wasn't home field. It was just looking at the depth charts. Ohio State, I feel if I'm an Ohio State person and it's going to come down to special teams right now, I feel way better about where I'd be if I was Ohio State. Noah Ruggles, he had 95 kicks last year between PATs and field goals. He missed one.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
Yeah, that's it. Missed one. And now, again, does he have a lot of long kicks? No, but give me a kid that's going to go 94 of 95 and all of his kicks over the year, and I'll take that any day of the week. If I got to win a game on a 55-yard field goal, then we had a whole lot of other problems in the first 59 and a half minutes than we did with our place kicker. But he's a really steady kid. And then their punter last year too, Jesse Mirko, was a solid player. I mean, solid. And John Sott, we got to see. We got to see what he can do. But those two guys would certainly be in there for me. Yep. So that's the list. And so if we were going to talk about Notre Dame and their position groups, I would take Notre Dame's offensive line over Ohio State or BYU for me. I definitely would for me. On the others, I wouldn't take Notre Dame's defensive line over Clemson's. I wouldn't take Notre Dame's linebackers over Clemson's, although by the end of the year that conversation may change. And right now I'm still going with Clemson's secondary or Syracuse's. Well, you know what? That's the one I want to have the conversation about.
Yeah.
Because Notre Dame has the best 1-2 punch in this conversation, and I don't think that's debatable. Because Garrett's better than Cam, but it's not nearly by significant of a margin as Brandon Joseph is over any of the safeties that they have.
Yes, it is a fascinating conversation. Brian, I wish I had a little bit of a forecast as far as what the other two positions in Notre Dame's second, if they're just solid to good, it's kind of a no-brainer for me, if I'm being completely honest, but you just too much volatility right now, man.
Let me ask you this question. If you took out the bowl game, are we having the same are you having the same hesitancy?
A little bit. I mean, still a little bit.
I don't think you would. Because you can't remove from your head. That was so bad. That game was bad. So bad.
If I'll tell you this, if I was sitting here today and it was just one of Ramon Henderson or Xavier Watts, one of those guys just took hold of the starting position, not even talking about the other corner for a second, I would be like, yep, give me Notre Dame secondary.
I get you.
It's just the uneasiness of did anybody step up at those positions? That's just where I'm sitting, and I'm just even the other corner spot. It's I hope Clarence Lewis is just playing such good football that nobody can unseat him, but also I was kind of hoping that Ryan Barnes and a couple other guys would at least put more pressure on him, and it just doesn't seem like that's
And that's what we got to see, right, Ryan? We got to see, okay, is Clarence starting because he made big improvements?
Sure.
I did have a source text me today that the secondary has had a great camp. My response was, I hope that's because of how good they're playing and not because the receivers are struggling. You know what I mean? But we'll have to see about that. But I do think we're seeing more sharpening iron this year in fall camp. And I think that's a big, because last fall camp, the Notre Dame secondary dominated the Notre Dame receivers. I mean, and we knew why once the season started. But I think the offensive players are making more plays this year, but the secondary is still, that's what people say. Again, we'll see, because all that sounds great in fall camp, but I got to see it on a Saturday. I'm sorry. So my thing is, I am still going to go with Syracuse today, but I think by the end of September, we'll have a much better idea of whether or not that's going to continue. Because we're just talking about isolating the secondary. We're not talking about as part of a defense. We're just talking about the individual parts to that. So, that's where I'm going to be. Now, here's a question for you. Where would you rank Notre Dame's backfield, quarterback and running backs, in this group? Because you're very high on the Notre Dame. Well, but again, you just said you're projecting with a lot of players, right? I'm asking you to project on this one. They're not in the conversation for number one. That's not even a discussion. But moving forward, after that, that's where I think it gets interesting, because I know you're very high on the Notre Dame running backs, and I'm extremely high on Tyler Buckner as well.
Yeah, I mean, so if I'm looking at the schedule, Ohio State, obviously, we've already talked about. They're number one. Southern Cal, I would give it to number two just because of the proven production. Boston College, I would also give to. Then after that, I think that's where Notre Dame comes into play. So I guess the fourth spot would be where you have a conversation with a Syracuse, I guess, just because they have more proven production. I mean, they have Sean Tucker, who was one of the best running backs last year.
The quarterback one. Here's the thing with Syracuse and BC where I think we can have a conversation. And we're not going to spend too much time on this. We're going to go to the mailbag next and get out of here. We don't have many questions today, so our mailbag should be pretty quick.
Yep.
It's the depth at Notre Dame's running backs is where I go from. You've just mentioned the number one running back being better because of the proven production, and I don't disagree with that. But it's like, what happens if that guy goes down?
Sure.
Notre Dame is in a much better situation. And I think by the end of the year, I think by the end of the season, if I were to say, hey, Ryan, Patrick Garwell was granted another year, and BC proposed a trade Garwell straight up for Audric Estime, would you take it? I think the answer is going to be no.
It's probably going to be no.
Right. Just for the 2020, looking at the 2023 season. But to your point, that kid's got 7 carries for 60 yards in his career. Patrick Garwell's coming off a 1,000-yard season. That's the thing about this Notre Dame team that, yes, there's talent, but there's a lot to prove. There's a lot to prove, and how quickly are they going to get up to speed is going to determine just how good this football team is this year. There's no doubt.
This is why the idea that you floated out that someone put in the chat earlier about bringing this back up in January is going to be fun, man. It's going to be really fun because then we'll get to see wow, now where would Notre Dame's guys rank in this group, right? Just kind of knowing what we know type of thing. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting because Tyler Buckner just affects the game. If he's the guy we think he is, and he affects the game in just so many different ways. I mean, we're talking about the backfield, right? But I mean, the ability for him as a runner can't be discounted in that conversation too, So it's interesting.
Yep, no doubt. So I think right now we agree 1 and 2. Right now we agree on that, just because the other thing about USC that's different from BC, and I'm kind of circling back to the earlier argument when I was like, BC and USC. I was looking at the starters, but I think that's also where I think USC separates themselves from Boston College is if Travis Dye goes down, they still have other guys. They still have Austin Jones, still have other running backs. Whereas if Garwell goes down, it's like, I don't know what BC is going to do at that point in time.
I don't know who else BC has on the roster because I mean David Bailey transferred to Colorado State 2 years ago, right? So I don't know who they have.
So it's going to be that was he had a very weird descent as a player.
Sure,
really weird descent because in 2019 as the number 2 behind AJ Dillon, he looked really good.
He did.
He just got worse and worse and worse.
And now then he followed Adazio, and then now he is in the air raid. I think that Colorado State's running right.
Who they hire as their new coach?
It was the guy that was at Nevada. But he brought over Matt Mumme with him, Hal Mumme's son. So they're running the air raid.
Okay.
So
now I don't even remember who their football coach is.
It's I can't remember his last name. You're gonna say it. I'm gonna be like,
Jay Norvell took the Colorado State job.
Jay Norvell. That's
really?
Yep, Norvell.
Okay, because you said Nevada. I was like, I didn't know Jay Norvell left Nevada.
Yeah, Norvell left, and then he took Matt Mumme with him. So Matt Mumme's gonna be running that air raid over there.
Interesting. So. That's wild. That's why actually. It's interesting. Very interesting. I had a chance to meet Jay Norvell back in the day. I went to the Indianapolis Colts training camp. I knew a scout there at the time, so I went to their training camp, and he was their receivers coach. So they let me into this was one of the most fun days of my life. They let me into their little film room. It's just a wall full of, I don't know what they're called, like these little look like mini 8-tracks that you'd put in.
Really?
Yeah. Like, I don't know. They weren't mini 8-track. They were just like, they look like it. They almost kind of look like Nintendo things. Right. But
the cartridges or whatever.
Yeah. And you'd put it into the thing and you'd watch the film. It was phenomenal. I'm sitting there just spent like 3 hours just sitting in the film room watching their film. It was at Rose Holman. It was when I was at Wittenberg. So that was a lot of fun. Gotcha. And so I was sitting there having breakfast, and then Peyton Manning sat beside me, and Edgerrin James sits across me. I'm like, okay, don't be that guy. Don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy. Don't talk to him. You know what I mean? So I just kept eating, talking to the guy next to me. Yo, what's up, Peyton? How you doing, player? I was not going to be that guy.
It's the edge. Yeah. I'll say this, though. You mentioned Jay Norvell. I actually had a conversation. I actually got to talk to Matt Mumme last year because he had Carson Strong and all that type of stuff. And he is a strange cat, man. I like him, but he's a
Yeah.
strange
Well,
cat.
I mean, think about who his dad is.
Yeah, exactly.
His dad's a strange dude too, man.
Sure is.
His dad's a strange dude too. So anyway, but yeah, that was the most awkward experience. It's like, because Peyton's reading his paper and he wasn't being rude. It's just like, okay, he doesn't know who I am, and I'm like, okay, don't be that guy. Keep talking to the guy across from me. Keep talking to the guy across from me. Just be cool. Be cool, man. Be cool. Be cool. Act like you've been here before. So that's
did you see his the production stuff that he does now is called
Yeah.
Omaha
Well,
Productions?
I wrote an article promoting the thing they did with Notre Dame, because his production company reached out and said, hey, could you run a piece, talking about this? And I was like, well, I'd love to, but like, I haven't seen it yet. And I'm not going to write a piece talking about how cool something is that I've never seen. That's not who we do, what we do. So they actually sent me a pre-screening of that thing that they did with Marcus Freeman. That's why I wrote the article. It was great. I loved it. I don't know if y'all have seen it. It was on ESPN Plus, but it was really well done. It was like a 25-minute episode, and they packed a lot of Notre Dame history into 25 minutes, man. It was really well done. I think I sent it to you to watch. Really well done. So if you haven't seen that, definitely check that out. So that is kind of where we're at. So that's going to do it for this part of the show, Ryan. Hit that like button, everybody. Hit the subscribe button. Hit that notification bell and share this podcast. So, Ryan, let's move on to the mailbag. We don't have a lot of questions today. If you all have questions, go ahead and get them in now. But we'll address this one off at first. Michael S. says, looks like Dell Alexander redo with Washington, lose a 5-star, get a 3. He can't get them or hold them. He's Elston too good, but not a gap closer. Let's hope he can at least coach. I don't know what your beef is with Al Washington, but it's a little strange, Michael. I'm going to be honest with you. Number one, they didn't replace Keon Keeley with Armel Mukam. They don't play the same position. Losing Keon Keeley was a huge loss. Huge loss. My question is, what defensive line coach in the country could have been here and made that not happen? That's my question.
Well, I was going to say, Brian, this is a great talking point because you just mentioned it, right? If Mike Elston is still the defensive line coach, is Keon Keeley still in the class? I don't think so. I don't think there was anything that Al Washington could have done in this situation. If
you traded defensive line coaches and you took Bama's defensive line coach and put him in Notre Dame and put Al Washington at Alabama, what changes? This wasn't about Al Washington. Now, again,
it was about Alabama.
If you want to criticize Al Washington, then say, like, here's what people are missing. If you want to be critical of Al Washington, you should be saying you lost Jason Moore and you replaced him with this kid.
Yes.
That should be the conversation, because that did, in fact, happen. You're going to lose guys. What I don't like is that I feel like we're not having an objective criticism, because here's what's happening a little bit too much on the Irish breakdown boards is the people that are super optimistic are just kind of ganging up and swarming on the people with negative points of view. The problem is some of the people with the negative points of view are being sort of, it's easier to go at them because the arguments are just not strong. This is not a strong argument to make in regard to criticizing Al Washington. It's just not. There are other arguments to make on this, but simply looking at, you lost a 5-star, you got a 3-star. Okay, well, Jordan Davis was a 3-star. You know what I mean? Like, do we have to have this conversation every single time? This kid is not Keon Keeley. He's not Jason Moore, but he's also a he's also a talented football player with a lot of upside. So yes, Al Washington has things to prove at Notre Dame. There's no doubt, but he also got Boubacar Traore. He's a top 100 player. He got Devin Houston, who's a good football player. He's got a top 50 player next year in Brandon Davis-Swain. So yeah, he's got a lot to prove, but going to this extreme to be critical of him and doing it often, like putting in super chat so I have to read the criticism, is just a little strange to me. And I'm not quite sure what your beef is with Al Washington, but last year he signed the second best linebacking class in the country at Ohio State. And this year he's got a pretty darn good defensive line that is mostly made up of his guys. And I didn't even mention Brendan Vernon. He kept him in the class, who's a top 30 player according to Rivals. So Al Washington has some stuff to prove. To compare him to Dell Alexander is just absurd, if we're going to be honest with you. That's just absurd. And I don't know what your beef is, because this isn't the first time you've done this. I just don't understand what your beef is. But does Al Washington have a lot to prove, Ryan? Yeah, he does. As a coach and a recruiter, a lot of the first-year coaches do. But he's done pretty good so far. Not great, but pretty good. And we have to be able to balance those things, where we don't just say, oh, he's the greatest ever. And we also can't be like this. We have to, if we're going to have disagreements, we need to have them to be a little bit more well thought out, to be honest with you. And to me, this is just not a well thought out criticism.
Brian, I would also point into this. If you're gonna throw that shade at him for even saying the Keon Keeley thing, you also need to talk about the simple fact that if Mike Elston was the coach still, and Mike Elston did a really good job. Like, I'm not throwing shade at Mike Elston here, but don't you think that Brooks Barr would be in the class than a Boubacar Traore or somebody like that?
I think he wasn't necessarily complimenting Elston, though. He's saying he's good. Elston kind of looks like 2.0 is how I'm taking that. Good, but not a gap closer. Then. So I don't think he's saying if Elston was here, they would still have Keon. I don't think that's not how I took it. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I think I'm reading you that you're not saying that Elston would have kept him. He's saying that he's kind of like too good, but not a gap closer. Let's hope he can at least coach. So I don't agree with that sentiment. I mean, let's not forget, we weren't like if Notre Dame would have had a 5-star kid committed in 2019, lost him and signed Isaiah Foskey, the pushback wouldn't be as strong because he's not a 3-star kid. But there would have been people like, seriously, like you lost a 5-star and you got a kid that's not even ranked in the top 200. Come on now. But Isaiah Foskey's played like a 5-star, and that's the reality. Is does Notre Dame add to need more? There's a difference between saying Notre Dame needs to add more star players. They do.
Sure.
And then being critical of the fact that they just got this 3-star kid, because as I pointed on the message board yesterday, Notre Dame needed to get Armel Mukam to tie Alabama for the number of 3-star kids committed in this class. Because up until he committed, Alabama had more 3-stars in their class than Notre Dame did. And I'm not talking about specialists. I'm not cheating. And they have 2 3-star, a punter and a kicker. If you go there, that's 4 because they have a kicker who doesn't even have a ranking. I'm just talking about position players. They had to do that to tie. As I just mentioned, Jordan Davis from Alabama was not a top 300 guy. He was a 3-star kid on the 247 composite, right? So it's about building a program. And every time they don't get a 5-star is not like the invitation to go say, oh, see, this is why they can't do this. Because as I mentioned before, go back and look at the number of 2 and 3 stars that Alabama had on their starting defense back in 2009. I mean, I've pointed this out before. It wasn't impressive. Corey Reamer was a 3-star in the number 483 player in the country. I mean, I can do this all day. I mean, that entire starting defensive line was that way. Javier Arenas, 3-star, number 582 player in the country. Let's keep rolling. Yeah. Kareem Jackson. He was the number 16 JUCO kid. They don't have his ranking here, but I have done this in the past, and he was a 3-star kid as a high school kid, and his best offer, I believe, the guy that the team that Notre Dame beat him for, his next best offer was something like his number 2 team was like Bowling Green. Alabama got on him late and flipped him. Eric Anders, I think, was a 2-star, if I remember correctly. He was the other starting linebackers that they had, other outside linebackers that they had. And I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. So, I mean, to me, Ryan, it's just they need to add better players. They need to keep adding better players. There's no question. Brandon Diedrich, another starter on that defensive line, a 3-star in the number 623 player in the country. That was all off that elite Bama defense that won them a national championship. So you got to evaluate the players, number 1. And number 2, you've got to go out and say, what is this kid being recruited to be? Right. That's the other part. This kid's not being recruited to beat the other guy. And I'm saying this right now. Somebody is freaking out because apparently Steve Wiltfong put a crystal ball in for Notre Dame. Guys, hello. I mean, anyway, move on before I get pissed off.
Can I say something real quick, Brian?
Sure.
Notre Dame fans, IB Nation in the chat. If there are people that are LSU fans or people that are not being reasonable, just don't
ignore
say
them.
Anything back to them. They'll go away. That's how that works. Yeah.
Yep. So let's go to the other thing. Now, Michael, I will say this. I respect the fact that you are coming with this negativity at a time when there's a lot of positivity, because right now people that have criticism are like getting ganged up on. And I don't like that either. Like one of the things yesterday was you got to trust the staff. Well, that's not really fair, because that's what we didn't do that with Brian Kelly. I have more faith in this staff. So I'm willing to give this staff more benefit of the doubt. But we didn't have the same reaction that we had about Mookum as we did with Ben Minich. I wasn't as high on the Ben Minich hire. Ryan is a little more high on the Ben Minich hire. I'm not as high. I got to see his senior film, right? So, I mean, there's other guys that we're not as high on as some other people. I don't have Boubacar as a top 100 player. 2 other recruiting services do. But I do respect the fact that you're willing to kind of come with a negativity. I just think the argument's bad. I just don't think it's a good argument. I think that you can pose a question of, okay, is Al Walsh an elite recruiter? That's a legitimate question. And right now he has not proven himself to be so at Notre Dame. Right? He's been good, though. Elite? No. And keeping Keon was a big part of that. Now, if he wants to prove to me he's elite, go get Keon back. Right? That's or replace him with Caleb Herring or something like that. But I just think going to this degree is just a really bad argument, in my opinion.
Agreed.
All right, here we go. We got a question from Chris Basker. Who wins the O-line and D-line battles for each side against Ohio State?
Brian, this could be me being biased, I guess, but I think that Notre Dame should win both battles, right? I mean, the Ohio State's defensive line has not been developed properly, in my opinion, at this point. Notre Dame's offensive line should be a ton better. And then on the other side of it, Notre Dame's defensive line is kind of a known commodity. Like, do they have to improve in certain areas? Sure. But like, they were good last year and they have a lot coming back from that unit. And you're going against an Ohio State offensive line, which was not great last year. So I think that Notre Dame has the advantages in both sides, but there's natural projection where if Justin Fry is as good as I think Justin Fry is a really good offensive line coach. So if he does a good job, then it could be a stalemate maybe, or maybe it could be at least a closer affair. But I think right now, it's not unreasonable to say that I think Notre Dame has the advantage on both sides of the ball from a offensive and defensive line perspective. That's just my opinion.
I agree. Now they got to go out and prove it. And I think the thing that I would say is, to his question, is who wins the battle. If Notre Dame's going to beat Ohio State, they can't just win the battle on the defensive line. Right. Like, I would argue, Ryan, and I'll say this again, I think that Notre Dame slightly outplayed Alabama's offensive line in 2020. I think Notre Dame's defensive line slightly outplayed Alabama's the offensive line in 2020. Would you say that's at least arguable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It didn't matter because they needed to dominate Alabama's offensive line to make up for some of the other areas where they weren't able to match up with Alabama. That's still going to be true. Even if the Notre Dame secondary is what we hope it is, it's still going to be a tough matchup against Ohio State's offense. It is. So they can't just win the battle. They just can't win the battle against the Ohio State defensive line. They have to dominate the battle. If they're going to win this game, it can't be who's the edge. Notre Dame won on points at the end of the game in that particular matchup. I'm making a boxing reference. If Notre Dame wins on points in a football game, obviously they win the game. That's not what I'm saying. But like, in a boxing match, Ryan, where it's like it's a split decision, but this team won on 2 cards and that team won on 1 card. It can't be that. It's got to be. It can be a 12-round fight, right, that goes to the very end, but it's got to be one of those ones where one guy just dominated the other dude, and the other guy just had a tough jaw and strong legs, was able to stay for 12 rounds. It can't be a close fight if Notre Dame is going to have a chance to win, because Ohio State has the significant advantage in some other areas that Notre Dame needs to be better at. But that's the thing, is these are the advantages you're supposed to have. And if you're going to win this game, you have to dominate those two. You can't just win them. And that's not what Chris is saying. I'm just adding my own commentary to the conversation.
Yeah.
So very good question, Chris.
There needs to be a superiority to this conversation at the end of the day. Like, Notre Dame needs to dominate, not just win the battles, to Brian's point. I agree completely on that.
Right. Tony Shea, here's the thing, buddy. And look, he says, what was wrong with my post? There's nothing wrong with your post. It's the reaction to it, to like let's effing go. Like, that's what, like, that should be like, oh yeah, okay, 247's finally reporting what Ryan's been reporting for the last month. Like what Ryan had on the message board, 3 days ago with an intel port. Yeah. I mean, that's my frustration, right? Is like, people come here and like, so-and-so reported something. This is great news. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, that's not news to people that at Irish Breakdown. I guess that's kind of my frustration, Tony. So I apologize if you took it wrong. It's just, that's my frustration is, oh, so-and-so did a crystal ball. If we did silly things like that to take away people's shine, we'd have done that 2 months ago and never would have changed it. So yeah, that's kind of,
we're getting crystal balls is what you're saying?
No, we're not. I said, if we did silly things like that, so yeah, see, there you go. Always trying. So you're trying to get me fired up.
I'm
Blaine
trying to lighten
Tiller
the
said,
mood,
"Do
man.
you think Clemson would be better in the Clemson system with PJ as quarterback instead of DJ?" Yeah. Would you say? I mean, in their system, I do think he would be a better player than DJ. Phil Jurkovec would be a better player than DJ. Absolutely.
Yes, I do think he would be a better player. I still don't think it'd be a perfect fit, though. Like I still don't love PJ. I still don't love Jurkovec in that system. But
Explain why.
In that system?
I don't love that system, so I don't love anybody in that system.
Sure. Look, it's very like there's like a big emphasis on just like playing shortstop at quarterback, basically, right? Like you're getting the ball out quick, you're throwing some RPOs, you're throwing a bunch of screens. It's very spread oriented, but like college spread, not like a pro style spread. And I like Jurkovec more in a like let's stress vertically,
sure,
right? Like
sure.
Kind of like so I just don't love the fit overall for either player, if I'm being honest. But I do agree. I think that Phil Jurkovec would be better in it.
I think he would be much better. He would be much better for this reason. Why? Because they tried to use DJ as a runner last year. And I actually do think you can use Phil on Power O or Q Power and some of the things they try to get him to run on. I think that Phil is a better deep ball thrower than DJ is. And they like to throw a lot of deep balls. So that's why I think Phil would be much better in that system. I think your beef is similar to mine, Ryan. I just didn't like. Now, when we talk about it, we're talking about what we saw from the system last year. I don't know if it's going to look like that this year. We don't know what it's going to look like now that Brandon Streeter's running it. He was the quarterback's coach, so I don't know how much different it's going to be. You hear things from Clemson people. It's going to change. It's going to be this. It's going to look different. They're going to make this wrinkle. They need to. They need to. And I hope Brandon Streeter does that. But it's if we're just looking at what it was, and what it was, Ryan, I didn't like it. I didn't like the system. I don't know what happened to Tony Elliott the last 2 years, but it was really poorly done. But I think Phil would have been much better there because Phil could do a lot of that running stuff. Now, Phil's not a fast kid, but he's a really athletic kid. You put him on Q Power and some of that stuff, I think he would run that well. It's stuff he ran in high school. I actually don't think BC does enough of that, to be completely honest with you. They don't use enough of the Q Power, of the read zone stuff to let Phil do that. I kind of understand why. I kind of feel like they don't want him to get hurt. But I think they haven't used him enough of that stuff. But I think Phil would fit really well in that system because, remember, he is a spread kid. He ran that stuff in high school. And so the combination of him as a runner plus his deep ball throwing ability, I think would have really fit into that offense much better than DJ. But to your point, Rand, I just didn't like the system last year. I thought it was stunk. There's no method to the madness. They didn't recruit well to it. They weren't recruiting the Amari Roger, Hunter Renfro type kids anymore. They were just trying to recruit a bunch of like tall outside guys. Yeah. But the tall outside guys they had in 2008 could freaking run. And the kids they've recruited the last couple of years couldn't run like that. You know, like Bo Collins being Miles Boykin, I think would be really good. But that's not what that offense looks for. And so I don't think Bo Collins is a bad football player. I think he's a pretty talented football player. I just don't think he fit that system, is my point.
Yeah. I think they have a couple of those guys that are pretty decent players. Like I think he's a good player. I think they have another kid named Collins, different first name, if I remember correctly. And then they have Joe Angada, who's like the same guy, right? Like that's the issue though, is it's just not.
He's a Javon McKinley type. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So again, in Joe Angada in Notre Dame's offense of 2020, playing the Javon McKinley roles, good football player. Trying to be T. Higgins? Trying to be Justin Ross? You know, and I think that's the thing is if Brandon Streeter adapts the pass game to fit the personnel he has, that I think will make the Clemson offense a lot better than it was last year. Yeah. A lot better. And that's what we need to see. But in what the system that we had, then it's a different deal. And that was my issue. Clemson didn't all of a sudden not have any talented kids. Right. That wasn't the issue. The issue was more they had talented kids playing and doing things that like I don't think DJ's a bad quarterback. No. I think he's got some accuracy issues and some other aspects of it, but he's not as bad as he looked last year. Now, he's not as good as he looked the year before, but he's not as bad as he looked last year. I think he's somewhere in the middle. I just think the system was really poorly designed for him. And I'll say this, I think that he would do better in BC's offense. Not than Phil, but just then, like I'm only looking at DJ in a system that's drop back, pro style, you know what I mean? Though I think he'd be better there than he was in Clemson's system. I think Phil's better than him in both because I think Phil's a better quarterback than he is. That's just a fact. So very interesting question, Blaine. Very interesting question. Here's a good one from Scott Yerbick. Who is the best player Notre Dame will face this season? Not highest draft pick, so value, but just flat out best player that Notre Dame is going to face this year.
It may end up being the highest drafted player, though, and I think it's Myles Murphy. Man.
Okay,
like I think
interesting.
that kid's
I was only saying that because I could see C.J. Stroud being the number 1 overall pick. That's that's more value related. Right.
Sure. In a vacuum, though, the best just overall football player, like Myles Murphy's a game wrecker, man. Like he can play outside, can work some inside. Like he is there's moments where he's just overwhelming. Like he's an overwhelming football player. So he's literally a player, Brian, that like I think, do you remember how Stanford used Solomon Thomas when he was there? Right.
Yeah.
As like a kind of a gap penetrating interior player. Myles Murphy can do that, but also rush the passer from the outside and be a dog in the run game. So I see Myles Murphy and I'm just like, that kid could be a game wrecker against in stopping the run, and then also gives you big upside in passing game as well.
Yeah. I would go with Myles Murphy now. Here's where I want to take that's an easy one for me. I think he's incredibly talented. Here's a question I want to ask you. I think would be a little bit more interesting. Who is the best player that Notre Dame will face on Saturday, September 3rd?
Best,
just not value, but just the best player that they're going to face.
I think it's CJ or it's Jackson Smith and Jigba. I
wouldn't go with either one of them.
Really? Who would you go?
I just think their most talented player is Trayvion Henderson. I do.
Oh, okay.
I just think he is just God-given ability, just incredibly talented. Now, those other two guys are more established, but just best player, not most important, not, highest value because he's a quarterback or receiver, just best player. I think I'll put it like this. If I was just kind of doing like an NFL draft grade or not even, but a version for just grading college football players, I think by the end of the season, I think we're going to be looking at it a little different. I think it could end up being Trayvion. I think if you put the proven production aspect in it, he can't be that guy. You got to take one of the two kids you mentioned. If I'm looking at it just a little differently than your answer, and that's why I want you to answer first. You're looking at it proven production, key to the offense, and talent. I simply looked at it as a upside thing, and that's where I went with Trayvion.
So would there be any conversation to Trayvion versus a Paris Johnson Jr. then, if you're just looking at pure upside?
No, because I think Paris Johnson Jr. is really talented. I just don't know if he's there yet, or if I got to see him play tackle first, right? And I remember in high school, he was really good in high school. I didn't love his senior year, to be completely honest with you. He's very talented, but I still would take Trayvion over him at this point in time. I would.
Sir?
I would. Like, I don't think Paris Johnson is quite as talented as Blake Fisher is. He's got a year of experience on him, but I don't think he's quite as talented. I think Trayvion Henderson, to me, has a chance to be really, really special. I do. I really do. But it's a good problem to have if you're Ohio State, to be having that debate where you could make an argument that CJ Stroud isn't their quote unquote best player. And, it's would love for Notre Dame to be in that situation someday from a skill player standpoint. There's no doubt about that. Here's another question here. Guinea pig clips. Can Notre Dame win at Ohio State without forcing a turnover? I think Michigan did. Did Ohio State not turn the ball over against Michigan?
They may not have. I don't think Stroud threw an interception, so unless they fumbled, I guess not.
Well, let me. I'm just going to look this up because I don't remember one off the top of my head. They lost. They did not lose. They did not turn the ball over against Ohio State. They only had Michigan, and they only had one against Oregon.
Michigan just controlled that game, though, man. Like, just the pace of that game, the momentum of that game. I just never felt like Michigan was in trouble in that game, Like, it was just, can it happen? Yes, it can. I wouldn't throw anything off the table. But if Notre Dame is able to force a couple turnovers, then that would dramatically increase it. Like, it make it a lot easier on yourself. But I guess it's possible. Sure.
Yeah. It's like the thing the other day about can Notre Dame win if Tyler Buckner only throws for 190 yards? I just need more context, right? And like your immediate reaction, Ryan, was no, and I understand it. Just like my kind of gut reaction was like, no, I don't think you can beat Ohio State without forcing a turnover. But there's so much other context. Like, did he not turn it over because he was just throwing it away all day? Or you forced 3 fumbles, but they fell on each of them behind the line of scrimmage and you lost 5 yards on each one? There's just so much context that's needed. What I will say is Notre Dame cannot beat Ohio State if they allow Ohio State to play a clean game on offense. That they won't do.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Because that includes disruptions, drop balls, fumbles that you don't necessarily recover, right? Because it's a fumble's not a turnover because you can still recover the fumble. I could see where they force Ohio State into 3 turnovers and lose, depending on where the turnovers are. Like if you fumble at the 3, your defense stops Notre Dame on a 3 and out, and they punt, and you get the ball back at the 35. It's like, okay, you're still going to get you know what I mean? Like it just depends. There's so much context that's needed, but I would feel a lot better if Notre Dame forced a turnover. But as we showed last year, it
can happen.
It can happen. Yeah. The only game that Ohio State played really bad in, where they turned it over multiple times, is the Nebraska game. They had 2 turnovers in the Nebraska game. And that was a game that could have been Scott Frost's sort of kind of coming out party a little bit if he would have been able to close that thing out. But, obviously they weren't able to get it done. Yeah.
Man.
Yep.
Poor Frost. Poor Frosty.
Yep. Chief Brody says, Brian, if you could take I'm going to ask you this first, Ryan. If you could take a torrential downpour ahead of the Ohio State game, would you do it? I think Notre Dame's edge in the run game means that would be a no-brainer.
I think the appropriate question that it's trying to go to, Brian, is, are Notre Dame's chances better in a rain game than it is in a non-rain game? And for that just general sense, I would say yes. But I also think that the torrential downpour would limit a lot of what would make Notre Dame special and balanced offensively. So I don't think it would 100% be like cut and dry. Yes. Right. But like I would steer towards the yes, right? Like if it's a bad weather game, I do think Notre Dame has a much better chance of winning than if it was just sunny and not slick and all that stuff.
Yeah. I think they have a better chance, but I don't know if it's significantly better for a couple reasons. Number one, Ohio State has field turf. The reality is, in today's era, rain doesn't affect field turf like it used to, number one. Number two, I don't think that Ohio State's going to be this awful running team this year. If they have to put the game on Trayvion Henderson's shoulders, it's still the game plan we talked about. It's you got to stop the run, and Notre Dame's got to prove that they can do that. Ohio State's offense wasn't consistent running the football last year. We agree on that? Notre Dame's defense wasn't consistent stopping the run game last year. So they gotta prove that. But number two, what often doesn't get talked about in these situations is there are circumstances I could point to where a wet field could be detrimental to Notre Dame. Jackson Smith-Njigba catches a bubble screen, and the Notre Dame player plants to drive outside and falls down, slips in the rain.
Sure.
That happens too on wet fields. Your offensive line can't get their feet sunk in. And some fields are slicker in the rain than others. Like if we were playing on a grass field, it'd be a problem because you can't keep the ball dry on a grass field. It's a lot easier to keep the ball dry on a turf field than it is a grass field, because on a grass field, it's harder to it's easier to keep the ball usable as a passer as long as you have good size hands and hand strength on a turf field than a grass field, because on a grass field, the problem for a quarterback is not only do you get rain on it, but you actually get grass clippings and mud on it. And that's what can make it really hard to throw on a grass field. On a turf field, you just don't see teams struggling the way they used to. I think also as a receivers coach, I have always felt that on a rainy field, just from a pure route running standpoint, it's advantage wide receivers. So it would have to be like really heavy rain. And he said torrential downpour ahead of the game. I think the only way Notre Dame gets a big advantage is if it's a torrential downpour during the game. That's where I think the pass game gets really affected, is if it's during the game, because then it's a lot harder to throw the ball because you can't throw it as hard or as fast because there's literally weight coming down on it. Because when it's just rain, it's about slipperiness. That's it. But CJ Stroud is, from everything I've seen, has got the kind of hand size and hand strength that's going to allow him to still throw the ball. I mean, like when it got cold last year against Ohio State, I didn't think that affected CJ Stroud's throwing ability. Might have affected his psyche as a kid from California. I don't know, but it didn't affect his throwing ability. Like he didn't struggle to throw the ball against Michigan in the cold. And the cold for a quarterback sometimes can be worse than rain, because in rain, your hands actually like they expand a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, the ball's wet, but when it's cold, your skin shrinks, it condenses and it's tighter, and it can be harder sometimes to grip the football. So that's what I would say is I don't think it gives them much of an advantage. And if anything, I'd be worried about Tyler Buckner getting out on the perimeter and slipping and falling on a wet field. I want a dry field. I want there to be no excuses, because I think Notre Dame has speed. I think Notre Dame can run. I think that a dry field takes away some of that a little bit, because Notre Dame is not a power football team, in my opinion, Ryan. They're not a line up in 12 personnel with all these big backs and just crush you, right? That's just kind of how I look at it.
I have a great comment that I need to pull.
Yeah, I know where you're. Oh, okay, you're going a different one.
Number one ND fan says Notre Dame could run the triple option in a downpour. Very true. It's a very good point.
Such a bad idea. As Sid says, tell BK that in 2015-16, 45-mile-an-hour winds in the monsoon, throw it 50 times, idiot. Yes, he is. And but what's interesting is that was on a grass field. The one in 16 was on a grass field. It was also an incredibly windy day. And this is kind of my point, Sid, is the thing about the NC State game, it was raining during the game.
Mm-hmm.
That's different than if it's raining before the game. If you were going to tell me it was going to be a torrential downpour during the game, then that's where I think Notre Dame would be able to get an advantage. But I don't want that. If Notre Dame's going to beat Ohio State, I don't want there to be any excuses. And if they can't beat Ohio State, then I don't want there to be any excuses on Notre Dame's side either. Look, because I want to evaluate where are you as a program. I don't want any excuses in that evaluation, because you can't get better if there's always circumstances that kind of make it seem like, well, can we really evaluate ourselves from that game? I want it to be a dry day, and either Notre Dame is good enough or they're not good enough. That's kind of how I want it.
Double tight, double wing. Let's go, baby.
Yep. So here's a question, Ryan, that we got here from Caleb Collins. He says, how do you compare 2014 Ohio State to Notre Dame this year? In my opinion, I think they're going into the season. They are very comparable. It's an interesting one. So that was the team. They had JT Barrett at quarterback. You were replacing – actually, no, you were going to have Braxton Miller at quarterback, but he got hurt in preseason. JT steps in. And then he got hurt late in the year, but it was late. I mean, you were in your 12th game of the year when he got hurt. You didn't have
Jones thing.
Yep. You didn't necessarily have a really, to me, proven receiving core. Devin Smith was a good player. Evan Spencer was a good player. Michael Thomas hadn't really, that was Michael Thomas in 2014 was really kind of the first year we saw anything from him. He played in 2012, only had 3 catches, so there was some uncertainty. He ended up being a good player, and they weren't really good in September, if we're going to be honest about it. I mean, that Ohio State team in 2014 was not a really good football team in September. If you remember, Ryan, they really struggled with Navy in the opener. Yeah, and Navy really battled them tough for a while. Then they went and lost to Virginia Tech, and then they eventually got rolling. But even in some of the blowout wins, like they didn't look great against Cincinnati. They blew Cincinnati out, but that wasn't a really good Cincinnati team, in my opinion. The week after the Ohio State beat Cincinnati 50-28, they lost to Memphis 41-14 at home. And then the next week they lost to Miami 55-34. That's who Cincinnati lost to Miami. That was a 6-7 Miami team. Cincinnati wasn't that good that year. So it took Ohio State a while to get rolling. I actually think Notre Dame is going to be a little better early than that Ohio State team was early. What I don't know is if Notre Dame can be better as late as Ohio State was. Because remember, they were doing a complete overhaul on defense that year. And because they had gotten rid of Everett Withers and they brought in Chris Ash. So they were doing – that team was doing a significant overhaul. And – you were breaking in a new quarterback, which is comparable. You didn't have a proven receiving core, which is comparable. you were going into year 3 of Tom Herman's offense. So I think they were kind of ready to hit their peak, which is comparable to Tommy Rees. I mean, I see the parallels that Caleb has drawn here. I really do.
Interesting.
Athletic run throw quarterback in his first year, unproven receiving core with speed. Devin Smith could run, offensive line that has the parts, but necessarily didn't play that great. I see the similarities. I do. I just think that Notre Dame is a little bit more proven than that Ohio State team was early. And I think that Ohio State team to me has a few more dynamic players that I don't know. Like, I don't know if Notre Dame has an Ezekiel Elliott, right?
Well, I was about to say, do they have somebody that's going to go down the stretch and do what Zeke did that year, right?
Right. I love Isaiah Foskey. He's not Joey Bosa right now.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, and that linebacking core they had that year was really good as well. Can Jason Adamiola be what Michael Bennett was that year? He's got the talent to be, but Michael Bennett had 14 tackles for loss that year. Can any of the Notre Dame linebackers be what Darren Lee was that year? And the other thing too is on putting the high end talent on the Ohio State secondary and the Ohio State defense in 2014 was greater than what Notre Dame's is, in my opinion. I think Maris could be as good as them, but they had Darren Lee and they had other guys. It wasn't just Darren Lee who ended up being a first round pick. They had Josh Perry on that team.
I was about to say Josh Perry was on that team.
Yeah. Raekwon McMillan was a freshman on the team. Curtis Grant was on the team. Their secondary, you had Eli Apple in the secondary. He was a freshman, but he was really talented. You had Von Bell on that team. That was a really high level team on defense. And I don't know if Notre Dame has that kind of high level talent across the board the way that Ohio State did.
Mm-hmm.
And on offense, I think Notre Dame has a chance to be better than Ohio State at most positions, but that running back difference is pretty big, man. Ezekiel Elliott was a dude. He was a dude.
On a separate note, Brian, I heard Josh Perry doing some commentating or analyst stuff. I had no idea he was doing that, man. He's pretty good at it.
He does really good. He's really good at that. He's very fair, very objective, knowledgeable, but he can explain it in a way that fans can. A problem that a lot of former players have is they talk over the head of fans. And I had that issue too. And I got criticized for that a lot by my bosses when I first started getting into this. And it was true. You're saying things that other coaches and players might understand, but can your audience understand it? And it's not disrespectful. It's just football. You use language that people may not know what that word means. Ryan, you and I have had that conversation. You'll use scouting language. I'm like, dude, I don't know what that means. We don't use that term, or you know what I mean? It's like,
Sorry.
It's not being so dang sensitive. But I think he does a really good job. That's what I've always liked about Jonathan Vilma as an analyst, is he can say really smart things in a way that's easy to digest. And that takes talent, because I've said this before. Part of the reason I don't think I would be a very good high school football coach is because I don't know if I'm capable of teaching what I know in a way that can be understood by 15-year-olds. I think it takes talent to do that. And that's why I've always had a great deal of respect for good high school football coaches, because they can take things I've met some high school football coaches that are wicked smart dudes, but how they talk to me is different than how they talk to their players, because I can grasp things that their players couldn't when I was a coach. So I think it takes a lot of that. And so I think but yeah, Josh Perry does, I've heard him a few times. He does a really nice job.
Yeah.
Nice job. Yeah. All right. So I want to see if we got any more stuff here. I think we are good. And I think we got not all the good questions. I know there's some, but I think we got to the questions that we needed to get to. And we'll comment from Sid Irish. We always bang on Sid for saying things negative, but I think this is a good one. He says, I saw Emil Wagner in the practice clips. He looks like a tight end D end. I really hope he can pack the weight. His athletic is gnarly. He's absolutely right on that, Ryan. He's athletic and he has strong hands, long arms and strong hands.
Length. Yeah.
Yes, but his athleticism is very good. And this is why we had him ranked low in our rankings on signing day, but also why he had 5-star upside. Because he could be a kid that never does anything more than what Joe Alt did last year before he started, which was you bring him in blocking situations as a tight end. And that he can do great there. But can he be an offensive tackle? He may never play a meaningful snap as an offensive tackle in his career because of the weight. But if he can get to at least 290 and keep his athleticism, I think Emil Wagner's got a chance to be a really good football player. Really good football player. The question here is, let's say that in 3 years, Elijah Page and Emil Wagner both reach their potential, and those are your starting tackles, just for argument's sake.
Yeah.
Because Jagasol, it's an easy thing. He's a right tackle, right? But if Page and Wagner both peak and they're both reach their full potential and they're your two best tackles, Alton, Blake are off to the NFL. Jagasol's moving inside. He's starting to guard, right? Who plays left? Who plays right? Because they're both more natural
Wagner.
left tackle. Okay.
Wagner.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, he's just got more upside as far as on the blind side. I think Page has pure left tackle upside as well, but like Wagner is just so physically gifted athletically. Like it's silly. It's silly.
Let me
and honestly, he moves like a tight end as well. Like, so that's
Yes. Let me, as a blocker, he does. Yes, as a blocker, he moves like a tight end. Let me throw a counter argument at you. I understand what you're saying, and I don't disagree with anything you just said. But I would argue that if if Emil gets to 290, he's going to be the better run blocker. And I have two thoughts to his size. Number one, you know my stance. All things being equal, I want my better run blocker at right tackle. It's just how I am. Number two, I still worry a little bit about him as his ability to anchor in pass protection. And as a quarterback, I want the guy that I'm a little bit more concerned with the anchor to my front side than I do my blind side. That's my only counter argument to that. One's a positive, one's a negative. Even the positive one is where I would be like, I'd have to think about that one. Could you imagine an offensive line that had Emil Wagner at his peak and Charles Jagasol at his peak on the right side of the line?
You move some people.
You'd be able to move some people. Yes.
You move some people.
Yes. You're going to have a good running attack at that point.
Oh, man. And you have like an athletic left guard, so you just down block, kick, pull and kick. Oh, yeah. It's not bad. It's not bad.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So anyway, that was a good one, Sid. I appreciate that. Appreciate that very much for that comment. Sparked some good final discussion. So, but Ryan, that I think that is it. That's what we're gonna end on that one. We're gonna end with Sid being positive. Good job, Sid. I'm giving you a hard time, man. I apologize. But before this thing gets off the rails too much, Ryan, everybody remember tonight there is we are back. The IB Nation Sports Talk Show is back tonight with Sean Stiers. He will be back tonight, and they're going to have a very interesting conversation tonight. It's going to be sort of a twofold thing. So Sean's son, Jesse, is one of his co-hosts, and Jesse will be on tonight. And they're going to do a breakdown of the 21 and 12 personnel groupings that Notre Dame has and just what those advantages could be for Notre Dame. So they're going to get a little bit technical on you tonight. So check into that, and that'll be at 6:00 Eastern tonight. That'll be Sean Stiers and his son, Jesse, which how cool would that be to be doing a show with your kid? And your kid actually is like smart and deserves to be on the show, which Jesse does. That would be a really cool thing for me. I'm not going to lie to you. That'd be a lot of fun. So anyway, although the way Jules is right now, I could see you and her doing a show together here in about a couple decades here with the way that she is. Yeah. So anyway, everybody's a little mad about his phone. Everybody, thanks for being on with us today. It was a great show. A lot of good conversation here. We appreciate you. Tony Shea, sorry for jumping on you like that, man. You're a good dude. We appreciate you being on the show. And we'll be back tomorrow at 1:00 Eastern. We're thinking about doing a mailbag and something else, but Ryan and I got to talk about it first. But I think it's going to be a lot of fun tomorrow. And then Saturday, 10:00 EAM, we kick off our IB Countdown to Kickoff show. We're going to talk about preview the Notre Dame season, make our predictions, and then the second half of the show, we're going to kind of make our college football predictions and then preview a couple games. We'll look at the Northwestern Nebraska game. That's actually going to be a really fascinating game, Ryan. And then you look at West Virginia Pitt. The backyard brawl is always interesting. And then Penn State Purdue is a sneaky important game in the opener for those two teams. So it's going to be a really fascinating weekend. I cannot wait to do IB Countdown to Kickoff. That's 10 a.m. Eastern, and that's why you need to like this channel and subscribe, but also hit that notification bell, share this podcast, sign up for the message boards. If you are listening via podcast, give us a 5-star review. We would greatly appreciate that. And also appreciate your patience sometimes when I snap on you a little bit. I promise I'll try not to do that anymore, especially the people that are longtime listeners. But sometimes certain topics just get me really fired up. And the crystal ball one is definitely one of those topics. There's no doubt about it. So anyway, have a great day, everybody, and we will talk to you again very soon. Thank you for joining us on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.